Along the Balkan Mountain Trails, travellers sometimes vanish without explanation, leaving behind only scattered gear, undisturbed campsites or footprints that abruptly end. These incidents, recorded over decades, reveal a terrain that is deceptively ordinary, yet capable of confounding even experienced hikers. As we move into the heart of these accounts, you will encounter day hikers lost on familiar ridges, overnight campers who disappeared under open skies, and visitors whose last moments remain an unresolved puzzle. Each story highlights how the interplay of rugged slopes, dense forest and shifting weather can obscure paths and unsettle perception, turning brief excursions into lingering mysteries. By tracing these cases across peaks, plateaus and valleys, you will witness how the Balkan Mountains quietly conceal the unexpected, leaving questions that continue to baffle locals and explorers alike. The missing hiker of Stara Planina's northern ridge. The northern slopes of Stara Planina stretch in jagged ridges and dense, unbroken forest, a place where even seasoned hikers find their sense of direction, tested by the uneven terrain and shifting weather. On a late autumn afternoon, one such trekker set out alone, drawn to the quiet majesty of the range and the isolation of its lesser-known trails. The hiker, a man in his early 30s with a record of long-distance treks, had prepared for cold nights and steep inclines, yet the mountain proved more unforgiving than any guidebook had suggested. By late afternoon, his GPS device recorded a sudden deviation from the mapped path, leaving only a fragmentary log that would later puzzle investigators and become one of the first entries in the growing record of strange incidents on the Balkan Mountain Trails. Narrow, overgrown paths stretch along the northern ridge, hidden beneath leaves, where each step can silently sink into the thick underbrush. Hikers report that visibility changes with the angle of light, and the low autumn sun casts long shadows that can turn familiar markers into indistinguishable shapes. On the day of the disappearance, wind gusts swept along the ridges, carrying the scent of damp pine and decaying foliage while the temperature dropped steadily, hastening the onset of twilight. Satellite data confirms that the hiker's movements became erratic at approximately 1642 local time, a detail that indicates he may have been attempting to correct his course or search for shelter as the weather turned colder. Locals describe the northern slope as a place of quiet intensity, where natural sounds are muted beneath dense conifers and rocky outcrops. The hiker's last recorded coordinates placed him near a small ravine known for abrupt drops and hidden rock formations. Search teams later noted that the area had been visited before by hikers who reported sudden fog patches that could appear without warning, reducing visibility to a few meters. This microclimate, combined with the narrowing trail and fallen leaves, would have made orientation difficult even for a well-prepared individual. Despite having a GPS-enabled smartphone, the hiker's signal weakened intermittently, possibly due to the terrain, and the partially traced log left no continuous path back to safety. The investigation began within hours after he failed to return to the trailhead. Local rescue units, experienced in winter conditions, moved quickly along established routes, but found little evidence beyond a few broken branches and footprints that disappeared into dense undergrowth. The initial search concentrated along the main trail, yet within 300 meters, the GPS trace suggested the hiker had diverged into an area considered impassable. Witness statements from earlier hikers that day indicate occasional distant sounds, like calls echoing off the rock faces, which no one could attribute to any human presence. These details contributed to the growing sense among rescuers that something about the northern ridge itself complicated movement and perception. Terrain analysis of the ridge highlights its irregularities. Short, steep ascents alternate with almost level ledges, and the soil is often loose with embedded stones. Such conditions can obscure footprints and tire tracks, making the detection of a single hiker challenging. Seasonal rains had left the forest floor slick, and early frost created hidden hazards under the layers of fallen leaves. The hiker's pack, described as a standard trekking backpack with visible reflective markings, was never recovered along the primary path, suggesting either a misstep off the main trail or movement into an area where natural cover quickly concealed any evidence. As darkness approached, the mountain's silence deepened. Nightfall in late autumn occurs early in this region, and with the absence of streetlights or nearby dwellings, the forest became nearly pitch black. Emergency teams used thermal imaging and flares to scan steep slopes, yet no heat signature appeared. The partial GPS data indicated that the hiker had moved toward a small valley between two ridges, where a creek runs intermittently during colder months. This creek is shallow but cuts through dense brush, and its presence can mislead hikers into thinking they are following a recognizable path. The northern slopes, while accessible, can quickly become disorienting when landmarks shift in the half-light, a phenomenon reported repeatedly by local hikers over decades. Documented patterns of previous disappearances in the region show similarities, deviations from mapped routes, evidence of sudden environmental changes, and the presence of physical obstacles that might seem trivial but are enough to confuse even experienced trekkers. While some cases involve rapid snowfalls or landslides, the Stara planina Northern Ridge incident stands out for its lack of dramatic environmental events. Meteorological records confirm mild winds and no precipitation on the day, yet the terrain's complexity and deceptive angles may have created a silent hazard that left no trace. Specialists in search and rescue training have noted that even minor errors in judgment on such trails can cascade rapidly, especially under low-light conditions, transforming a straightforward hike into a scenario where survival becomes a matter of chance. Communication attempts were sporadic. The hiker had carried a satellite-enabled device, but according to service logs, his attempts to send a location signal were interrupted by terrain interference. Sporadic pings reached authorities, and for a brief window searchers could triangulate his position, only to lose contact as the signal vanished once more. This sporadic connectivity fueled concern and speculation. Investigators later confirmed that the last recorded ping coincided with a point near a bend where the trail narrows and the forest canopy thickens, a known area for signal disruption. No evidence suggested foul play, leaving the environment itself as the central factor in the disappearance. Eyewitness accounts from hikers who later traversed the same ridge describe unsettling changes in perception. One hiker reported that landmarks visible in daylight seemed to shift at dusk, with familiar rocks appearing in different alignments and the trail bending in ways that contradicted earlier observations. While such reports are subjective, they provide context for understanding how even an experienced hiker might lose orientation. The Northern Ridge's topography is a mosaic of ridges, gullies, and minor cliffs, creating pockets of optical illusion and disorienting shadows, which may explain the partial GPS trace and why the hiker's path seemed erratic before vanishing. Rescue teams combed the area for days using tracking dogs, drones, and volunteers covering every plausible route. Despite systematic searches, they found no personal items, no definitive footprints, and no evidence of the hiker's movement beyond the final coordinates captured by his device. The forest slowly reclaimed any trace of passage, leaves covering disturbances in the soil and branches collapsing into previously walked areas. Experts from the Bulgarian Alpine Club remarked on how the ridge's quiet reclamation of its paths could render even the most meticulous search nearly fruitless within hours. The absence of remains or equipment has been one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. In addition to terrain and environmental factors, local folklore mentions hidden or deceptive trails within the northern slope that have led travellers to disappear without explanation over generations. While the modern investigation relies on verifiable data, these stories underscore the mountain's long-standing reputation for confusion and misdirection. It is worth noting that official records do not ascribe these phenomena to supernatural causes, but the consistency of these accounts, coupled with documented incidents, contributes to a persistent air of unease surrounding the area. Authorities continue to advise solo hikers to exercise extreme caution, emphasizing the use of marked routes and daylight travel. The disappearance of the hiker on Stara Planina's northern ridge remains unsolved. Investigators have pieced together the terrain, GPS logs, and eyewitness observations to form a coherent, if incomplete, narrative. While survival in harsh conditions is possible, the absence of the hiker, his equipment, or any trace beyond the partial GPS log suggests that the ridge itself, its deceptive paths, hidden ravines, and shadowed contours, played a decisive role. In the aftermath, search and rescue personnel often speak of the ridge with a quiet respect, acknowledging how quickly the forest can consume both human presence and memory, leaving only questions in its wake. The Northern Ridge's trails continue to attract hikers, yet each account of sudden disorientation reinforces a shared, unspoken caution. Locals, guides, and experienced trekkers alike note that once a hiker moves off a known path, Even briefly, the forest seems to respond, obscuring the way back, altering perception, and absorbing the wanderer into its quiet expanse. Despite the best preparation and modern tracking technology, the ridge remains capable of confounding, a subtle reminder that nature, no matter how mapped or measured, can hold secrets beyond immediate comprehension. And so, the man who vanished that late autumn day became part of the mountain's enduring enigma, a ghostly figure woven into the shadows of the northern slope, leaving behind only questions and the silent suggestion that the trail may have moved without him noticing. The Botev Peak Route, Disappearance. The climber had departed at dawn, carrying provisions and gear intended for a standard ascent of Botev Peak, one of the most frequented routes in the Balkan Mountains. By the time he passed the lower shelters, a faint mist hung along the ridges, weaving between the pine and beech forests and lending the landscape an unusually muted palette for late autumn. It was on this stretch, known for its predictable markers and reliable footpaths, that the incident, now catalogued among the strange disappearances on the Balkan Mountain Trails, quietly began to unfold. His intention was clear: follow the well-documented route to the Botev shelter, rest briefly, and continue upward toward the summit. Yet, something about the climb that day seemed subtly askew, as if the mountain were preparing to challenge even the most experienced traveller. By mid-morning, conditions appeared ordinary to casual observers, but meteorological data indicate that a sudden shift in wind direction brought low clouds rolling across the ridge. The trail leading to the shelter is generally wide enough for safe passage, with small drainage ditches and cairns marking turns and junctions, but under the drifting cloud cover, visibility diminished to barely 20 metres. Experienced climbers describe this segment as deceptively manageable, with gentle inclines that can mask shallow gullies or exposed rock, features that could easily mislead someone concentrating on maintaining pace. The climber's last confirmed sighting by fellow hikers occurred near a junction just before a series of narrow ledges that ascend sharply to the ridgeline, and from this point onward, official records show nothing but a sudden absence. At the junction leading to the shelter, he paused momentarily to adjust his backpack and check the map stored in a waterproof sleeve, a standard precaution for anyone ascending the peak. According to the trail specifications, this segment passes over alternating rocky ledges and forested patches where fallen leaves can conceal uneven terrain. The climber had traversed similar sections in prior treks, demonstrating familiarity with the mountain's subtle shifts in incline and footing. Yet, around 1348 local time, surveillance from a nearby weather station recorded a brief gust of wind, strong enough to sway the treetops and scatter loose stones along the trail. It was at this juncture that the GPS logs, later recovered from his smartphone, recorded a sudden deviation from the mapped path, a partial trace that ended abruptly near an area previously considered low risk. Search and rescue units were mobilised within hours after the climber failed to arrive at the shelter and missed scheduled check-ins. Teams of local volunteers, firefighters, and Bulgarian Alpine Club personnel divided into grid searches, moving systematically along both the main trail and adjacent minor paths. Despite the ridge being among the more trafficked routes, searchers faced unexpected obstacles: shallow ravines hidden by thick undergrowth, rocky outcrops where footprints could vanish within minutes, and forest patches that absorbed sound, leaving calls and signals seemingly unanswered. Drones equipped with thermal cameras scanned the upper slopes, yet no discernible heat signatures appeared, indicating that either the climber had moved into dense vegetation or the terrain itself had concealed him from detection. Other hikers who had passed nearby reported oddities that day, though none could account for the disappearance. One party mentioned the trail appearing narrower than usual, with familiar cairns seemingly shifted or missing, and a low fog that rose from the forest floor, curling around the trees and boulders in ways that distorted perspective. Such conditions, when combined with the rapid disappearance of GPS signals at certain points along the ridge, would have made orientation difficult, even for someone accustomed to the area. Small items, like a water bottle or glove, were notably absent from the trail, and while the shelter was fully stocked and had been visited earlier that morning, it offered no clue as to where the climber might have gone once he left the junction. Despite the reliance on modern tracking devices, intermittent GPS and mobile connectivity presented significant challenges. The climber's device emitted a final ping around 1412, placing him near a shallow depression just off the marked route, an area bordered by thin forest and scattered boulders. Signals thereafter were irregular, suggesting that the surrounding ridges may have interfered with satellite transmission. Communication logs confirm that attempts to establish contact were unsuccessful, reinforcing the conclusion that the mountain's natural features, steep inclines, uneven terrain, and dense forestry, were sufficient to complicate any attempt at real-time location tracking. Rescue coordinators later noted that similar signal disruptions had occurred in prior incidents along the Botev route, a pattern that hints at consistent technical and environmental challenges rather than human error alone. Rescue teams described the topography of the upper section as deceptively intricate, with the ridge tapering into several small ledges before reaching the shelter. Even minor missteps in this zone can result in sudden loss of orientation, as shadows shift with cloud cover and trail markers appear different depending on angle and light. Teams employed trained tracking dogs, though scent trails quickly dissipated among fallen leaves and undergrowth. Attempts to locate the climber using sound signals and visual markers were similarly unsuccessful. Observers noted that the mountain seemed to resist scrutiny, absorbing both the hiker and the noise of search efforts into a quiet, undisturbed expanse that left rescuers questioning whether the terrain itself concealed him deliberately or by coincidence. Experts from the Bulgarian Alpine Club and local mountaineering associations highlighted the ridge's variable conditions as a central factor. While the route is mapped and maintained, they emphasized that the combination of seasonal leaf cover, hidden gullies, and sudden fog can disorient even experienced hikers within moments. Small deviations from the mapped trail can escalate rapidly when visibility is low, creating the kind of partial evidence that searchers later encountered: fleeting footprints, broken twigs, and disturbed soil with no clear path forward. Meteorological records from the day show minimal precipitation, ruling out dramatic environmental events, yet the ridge's microclimates, pockets of sudden fog, wind gusts and frost-covered rock, appear sufficient to explain the climber's disappearance without invoking any human interference. Local guides have recounted similar incidents on the Botev Peak route over the years, noting that certain sections seem to repeatedly challenge orientation, particularly when conditions change unexpectedly. Reports include hikers losing track of minor cairns or encountering natural formations that give the impression of multiple diverging paths. These documented occurrences, while not directly analogous, provide a framework for understanding the climber's situation. A brief lapse in navigation, compounded by environmental factors, can produce a scenario in which a well-prepared individual effectively vanishes. All recorded attempts to retrace the climber's final steps revealed the same pattern of obscured paths and disappearing tracks, reinforcing the ridge's reputation as deceptively simple yet perilous. By late afternoon, as daylight waned, search teams began to consolidate findings and note the most likely areas of deviation. No personal items, no footprints beyond the partial trace, and no additional GPS signals suggested that the climber had either fallen into an inaccessible section or moved in a way that left no physical evidence. Observers emphasized that the Botev shelter, while in proximity, offered no practical guidance once the hiker had diverged from the marked route. Experienced rescuers reflected on the subtle interplay of preparation, environment, and timing, acknowledging that even meticulous planning cannot guarantee safety in a terrain that can transform in moments through light, shadow, and microclimate. Hours turned into a full day without resolution. Drone imagery, thermal sweeps, and multiple on-foot grid searches revealed no new insights. The mountain, while mapped and documented extensively, retained its capacity to confound expectation, demonstrating that even popular trails can conceal absences that leave no immediate explanation. Unlike sudden weather events or landslides, the disappearance occurred under conditions that should have been routine, heightening the sense of mystery and demonstrating the unpredictable challenges that Botev Peak can pose. For investigators and hikers alike, the incident serves as a stark reminder that familiarity with the route does not always equate to immunity from its hazards. Ultimately, the climber's disappearance on the Botev Peak route remains unresolved. Evidence consists solely of the partial GPS trace, minor disturbances along a rarely used side section of the trail, and the documented timeline of his ascent. Rescue personnel continue to advise caution, stressing adherence to marked routes and daylight travel, while acknowledging the ridge's capacity to obscure orientation quickly, and without warning. Even routine climbs on familiar paths, experts note, may conceal unexpected perils. The event has since become part of the broader narrative of unexplained vanishings along the Balkan Mountain Trails, its quiet defiance of explanation reinforcing a sense of enduring mystery. As evening shadows fell across the summit, the trail seemed to stretch onward while silently withholding all knowledge of what had truly happened that day. The Apriltsi woodsman who never returned. Early that morning, the woodsman set out from Apriltsi, boots sinking lightly into frost-hardened soil, his satchel laden with tools, rations, and a small radio transmitter. The forest was quiet, as it often is before the sun fully warms the northern slopes, and the familiar paths seemed almost expectant, awaiting the routine steps of someone who had walked them countless times. By mid-morning, his progress was recorded in brief radio check-ins to the forestry office, each message confirming normal movement along the marked trails. Yet, somewhere along this route, later documented as part of the strange disappearances on the Balkan Mountain Trails, he vanished, leaving behind only traces that hinted at a journey interrupted. The Apriltsi forest is dense, a mixture of beech and fir covering irregular terrain, with small gullies and hidden depressions that collect runoff from the surrounding hills. Fallen leaves and undergrowth obscure minor trails, and even a seasoned woodsman must remain vigilant to avoid missteps on slopes slicked by frost or early rain. As he followed a familiar circuit, he passed landmarks that had guided him for years: a bent sapling near a moss-covered rock, a narrow path rising toward a ridge, and a small clearing where sunlight touched the forest floor. Each of these markers, once reliable, now seemed subtly altered by the season's light, shadows shifting unexpectedly and lending a disorienting quality to an otherwise known path. The woodsman radioed late in the morning, reporting his return along a loop toward Apriltsi, a trail familiar from many previous journeys. His voice was steady, the tone routine, and the forestry office noted that the brief signal indicated both location and estimated progress. Yet within minutes of this transmission, attempts to reach him again failed. Signals flickered intermittently, weakened by dense canopy and terrain elevation, leaving an incomplete log that would later perplex searchers. These fragments established a rough timeline: departure at 8:15, last contact around 11:42, and no further verified position after that point. At a small creek that cut across the trail, the woodsman paused, noting what appeared at first to be ordinary, a scattering of leaves, the shallow flow of water, but then observed a minor anomaly: footprints partially obscured and misaligned, as if someone or something had passed moments before. The usual patterns of animal tracks were present, yet these impressions did not match any known wildlife in the region. He did not react immediately, trusting his familiarity with the area, but the sensation of subtle misplacement, of the forest shifting around him, lingered. It was the last recorded observation made before the woodsman disappeared. Search teams arrived swiftly once the concern was raised. Volunteers, forestry personnel, and police units began a coordinated sweep, mapping trails, clearing underbrush, and documenting every potential clue. The terrain presented immediate challenges. Uneven ground concealed footprints, fallen branches created false markers, and the forest absorbed both sound and light, making navigation slower than anticipated. Even trained dogs struggled to maintain scent trails, which vanished as abruptly as the woodsman himself. Within hours, the forest had reclaimed the subtle signs of passage, leaving rescuers with minimal evidence of the missing man's movements beyond the partial radio logs. In the hours following the disappearance, small items were recovered: an empty water bottle, a section of rope, a glove, but none offered definitive direction. Footprints ended abruptly near a dense thicket, leaving the impression of sudden vanishing. Experts noted that these minor clues were consistent with patterns observed in similar disappearances along Balkan Mountain Trails: partial traces, interrupted paths, and the forest itself acting as a silent archivist, preserving only fragments of events. Each new observation deepened the mystery, underscoring the forest's ability to obscure even the most mundane activities from external view. Technological assistance proved unreliable under these conditions. GPS devices and mobile communications, effective in open terrain, failed intermittently beneath the dense canopy. The woodsman's radio provided the only intermittent updates, yet even these signals could not penetrate the topography consistently. Rescue coordinators reflected on how these limitations compounded natural obstacles, creating a scenario in which a highly experienced individual could effectively vanish without evidence. The forest in this instance became not merely a setting but an active participant in the mystery, shaping the perception of space and time within its confines. Experts analysing the case highlighted the peculiar nature of microclimates within the Apriltsi woods. Small shifts in sunlight, temperature or wind can alter both perception and footing. Micro-obstructions, hidden gullies and frost patches can create disorienting conditions even along well-trodden trails. The woodsman, seasoned in these conditions, would have recognised minor hazards, yet the combination of subtle anomalies, intermittent communication and natural concealment may have contributed to his disappearance. Observers concluded that the incident reflects the forest's enduring capacity to challenge expectation, turning a familiar path into a labyrinth of uncertainty. Historical records of the Apriltsi area reinforce this pattern. Other individuals, often experienced forest workers or hikers, have briefly vanished under circumstances that seemed routine, only to reappear later with limited recollection, or in some cases not at all. The absence of dramatic environmental events, storms, landslides or snow, underscores the forest's subtle methods of concealment. In each documented case, minor deviations from standard trails, coupled with the forest's dense and changing structure, created situations where disappearance could occur without a clear explanation. By late afternoon, search efforts had expanded, with teams systematically documenting every minor trail, clearing undergrowth for evidence and noting unusual occurrences along the way. Despite the thorough approach, the woodsman remained elusive. Footprints had been erased by wind and leaf fall, scattered personal items provided no conclusive path, and the radio signal ceased entirely after the initial fragments. The forest seemed to reclaim its usual calm, leaving only the sense of absence, a void in the otherwise methodical sweep that contrasted sharply with the woodsman's meticulous nature. Witnesses who had traversed nearby trails reported a strange silence in the forest that afternoon. Birds were less vocal than expected, and animal tracks appeared unnaturally sparse. The lack of expected environmental cues heightened the sense of unease among searchers and volunteers. Even those familiar with the forest noted that the woods appeared subtly different, shadows falling in unusual patterns, familiar paths seeming to curve or end unexpectedly. These small, documented discrepancies contributed to the growing impression that the woodsman had been absorbed into the forest itself, leaving no trace beyond the partial radio transmissions. In the end, the case of the Apriltsi woodsman remains a mystery. Investigators have pieced together the evidence, the final radio transmission, fragments of trail markings, scattered personal items, and unusual environmental observations. While the search was thorough and spanned multiple days, no conclusive signs of the woodsman's location were found. The forest's dense structure, shifting microclimates and deceptive topography continue to challenge comprehension, demonstrating that even a well-known trail can conceal events that defy explanation. The case is cited in forestry and mountaineering circles as a stark reminder of nature's unpredictability and the limitations of human perception within its confines. Though the trails remain marked and the forest appears unchanged, something within it that day ensured that one experienced woodsman would never return to follow them. The Kotel Ridge mushroom forager. A sudden shift in the forest's undergrowth drew the mushroom forager's attention. A subtle disturbance among the ferns that seemed out of place in a path he had walked countless times near Kotel Ridge. His hand hovered over a cluster of oyster mushrooms, noting their spore patterns and the damp texture of their caps, while the surrounding forest held its usual chorus of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The stillness felt ordinary at first, yet the interruption, a broken twig, a slight indentation in the soil, hinted at movement that had passed moments before, a fleeting presence whose origin would never be confirmed. In the annals of the Balkan Mountain Trails, the disappearance of this forager would later stand as one of the more perplexing incidents, notable not for sudden weather or cliffs, but for the way the forest itself seemed to erase him from the landscape. Each step he took pressed into moss and soil, leaving faint impressions that were quickly absorbed by the forest's moisture. The Kotel Ridge is dense, a mix of beech, hornbeam and scattered fir, with undergrowth thick enough to conceal minor trails from casual observation. Fungi thrive in the cool, humid microclimates formed by fallen leaves and decaying wood, creating a living map that the forager knew intimately. He paused frequently to inspect promising clusters, measuring their growth, their edibility, and their relation to the surrounding flora. The repetition of this careful routine was part of what made him experienced, yet it could not protect him from the subtle dislocations that day, which would later confound rescuers. A faint, almost imperceptible wind carried the scent of damp earth and decomposing leaves, a familiar odour that he'd relied upon for years to orient himself within the forest. Yet, on this occasion, the smell was accompanied by something different, a fleeting trace of disturbance, scattered pine needles, slightly bent saplings, that suggested movement without a source. He looked up, scanning the treetops, and saw only the usual patterns of light and shadow, but an uneasy sense of anomaly lingered. The forest, which had been a reliable constant, now felt quietly unfamiliar, each familiar marker subtly altered by nature's shifting hand. The forager followed a narrow, worn trail that curved along a shallow incline, his gaze focused on the forest floor for edible fungi. His eyes caught minute irregularities. A cluster of mushrooms that should have grown in tight formation now appeared scattered, footprints that seemed too deep for his own boots, the sudden absence of animal tracks that normally crisscrossed the path. He paused to adjust his pack and check the tools he carried, noting that nothing was missing, yet the forest seemed to thicken around him, the canopy closing slightly as though it were aware of his presence. Later accounts of the disappearance would remark on this precise corridor as a point of strange activity, a stretch of woodland that, despite its ordinary appearance, had absorbed him without a trace. Nearby, the faint sound of running water marked a creek he knew well, a shallow stream that meandered through the underbrush. He knelt beside it to examine the soil, brushing leaves aside with gloved hands. The texture was familiar, soft, damp, holding the faint impressions of small mammals, but he noticed an indentation that was not his own. A careful measurement suggested it could have been recent, yet there were no other signs of passage, no scent detectable to trained search dogs, no snapped branches or displaced stones. This minute anomaly would later form the foundation of speculation, a clue that suggested presence but led to no conclusion. Locals who occasionally traversed the area reported seeing the forager entering the woods that day, noting his methodical movements and the steady pace that betrayed a practiced rhythm. He carried a small knife, a basket for collection, and a leather satchel, all of which would later be found scattered along different points of the trail, yet none provided a clear trajectory. The timeline was established from these observations: departure from a known cottage near Kotel around mid-morning, sightings along the ridge's edge, and the last confirmed location near the creek where the unusual indentation was later documented. Nothing thereafter offered certainty about where he went or what he encountered. Search teams arrived within hours, composed of local volunteers, forestry personnel, and law enforcement. They moved carefully, aware that the dense woodland and uneven terrain could conceal both people and evidence. Dogs were brought in to track scent, yet even the trained animals faltered, their efforts interrupted by the thick undergrowth and the damp, absorbent soil that erased traces as swiftly as they were made. Volunteers followed the familiar loops of the ridge, checking every nook where mushrooms might grow, yet found no indication that the forager had passed through after that final observed point. Each sweep deepened the mystery, emphasizing the woodland's capacity to obscure even routine passage. Small fragments of evidence emerged in scattered locations: a torn jacket sleeve snagged on a low branch, a gloved handkerchief caught among ferns, a basket tipped over and partially hidden beneath leaves. None of these items indicated a clear direction or movement, merely hinting at human presence in an otherwise undisturbed forest. Experts analysing the case noted how quickly forests like Kotel Ridge can erase the physical traces of someone's passage, especially during damp conditions in late autumn when foliage is thick, soil is soft, and microcurrents of wind disperse scent trails. The forest was absorbing him in ways invisible to conventional observation. Scientific and procedural insights offered a partial explanation for the disappearance's plausibility. Experienced foragers can lose their orientation when natural markers appear altered by seasonal change or minor environmental shifts. Low visibility, coupled with deceptively similar terrain, can transform even well-known paths into confusing labyrinths. The forest density, irregular gullies, and subtle topographical changes make it easy for a person to become isolated without immediate realization. These factors, while documented and understood, could not clarify the precise mechanics of this forager's vanishing, leaving only speculation supported by fragments and observed anomalies. Despite exhaustive searches spanning several days, the mushroom forager was never recovered. Teams retraced every known path, examined the forest floor meticulously, and documented every minor irregularity in the landscape, yet the woodland retained its usual quiet, concealing whatever had caused him to disappear. The case is frequently cited in local forestry records and mountaineering notes as an example of how ordinary activities, carried out in familiar terrain, can culminate in an unresolved mystery. The Kotel Ridge, in this instance, functioned less as a backdrop than as a participant in the disappearance, silently erasing and absorbing, leaving investigators with only questions and fragments. The forest retains its quiet and the trails appear unchanged, yet those who walk them now carry a heightened awareness. Familiar rhythms of rustling leaves, the scent of damp earth, and the subtle textures of moss and soil can conceal events that defy explanation. Even the most practiced observer may find themselves encountering a space where familiarity and anomaly meet, leaving room for disappearance without a trace. The forager's tools and basket remained untouched, yet the forest claimed him fully, leaving nothing but the quiet understanding that he had vanished amid ordinary surroundings. The Chumerna Plateau. Overnight camper. The wind moved across the Chumerna Plateau in long, low gusts, bending grasses and carrying distant echoes that seemed out of place in the vast expanse. A small tent had been erected near a shallow depression, its canvas taut and secured with familiar stakes, while a fire pit smouldered faintly, the ash still warm. Nearby, a scattered assortment of personal items suggested routine preparations for an overnight stay, yet the camper himself was absent. This incident, one of the more perplexing along the Balkan Mountain Trails, would later draw attention not because of treacherous cliffs or sudden storms, but because a campsite could remain fully intact while its occupant vanished without a trace. The plateau stretched outward in rolling rises and shallow hollows, its surface deceptively uniform, making the disappearance seem almost impossible against such an open backdrop. Setting out from a nearby trailhead known to local hikers, the camper reached the plateau in the early afternoon. He methodically selected a spot sheltered slightly from the prevailing wind, arranging a tent, firewood, and small gear with care. A thermos of water, a lightweight stove, and a small supply of food were neatly placed beside him, indicating an experienced hand familiar with the demands of overnight stays in high-altitude terrain. While the location was not dangerous in itself, the plateau's openness amplified the sense of exposure, making even minor environmental changes more pronounced. The orderly campsite contrasted sharply with the disquieting absence that would soon define the site. Clouds began to gather in the late afternoon, moving rapidly across the plateau, their shadows stretching and contracting over low rises and grassy hollows. Light fell unevenly across the surface, and subtle shifts in illumination caused familiar rocks and depressions to appear deceptively altered. From the tent's entrance, the camper surveyed the surrounding expanse, noting distant cliffs and a thin line of trees marking the far edge of the plateau. Though there were no signs of imminent danger, the subtle dissonance of light and shadow added a quiet tension, a suggestion that the environment could transform its appearance at any moment. Later, accounts emphasized how ordinary features became unreliable guides in such a landscape. A metallic tang lingered in the wind, likely from moisture on mineral-rich ground, and it stirred the sparse shrubs scattered over the plateau. Occasional sounds, the clatter of a rock dislodged by wind, the distant call of a bird, the creak of a tent line, punctuated the stillness. The camper moved among these minor disturbances, collecting small branches for the fire and checking the alignment of tent stakes. Though his actions were deliberate and measured, the plateau itself seemed to resist familiarity. Shadows shifted in ways that did not correspond precisely with cloud movement, and depressions in the earth occasionally appeared deeper or shallower than memory suggested, small optical anomalies that lent the environment a subtle strangeness. By early evening, the camper had completed preparations and settled near the fire, which emitted faint warmth but little light. The plateau stretched outward, empty and silent, and the fading daylight emphasized the sense of isolation. From this vantage, no paths, trails, or landmarks provided guidance beyond the immediate campsite. Distant cliffs blended into the horizon, indistinguishable from rolling rises, while intermittent gusts bent grasses and scattered leaves. The scene suggested normalcy, a simple, quiet night in the mountains, but in hindsight, it was a landscape that would soon render him effectively invisible. Local hikers passing the plateau the following morning reported the sight. The tent still pitched, the fire pit cold but intact, and personal belongings undisturbed. Footprints led toward the tent but did not extend beyond it, and no further signs indicated movement into the surrounding expanse. Observers noted the surreal precision of the scene. The campsite suggested recent human activity, yet the camper's absence created a dissonance between expectation and reality. This anomaly would later be central to investigations and local law, framing the plateau itself as an active participant in the camper's disappearance. Search teams were mobilized quickly, including local forestry personnel, mountain rescue volunteers, and law enforcement. They combed the plateau's ridges, hollows, and distant tree lines, aware that the wide-open terrain could both expose and conceal. Fog occasionally rolled across low rises, reducing visibility to a few meters and obscuring paths that might otherwise be discernible. Wind shifted constantly, scattering scent trails and rendering dog teams less effective. Despite systematic efforts and thorough coverage, no human presence was confirmed beyond the campsite, highlighting the plateau's unusual capacity to absorb a person without leaving a discernible trace. Around the fire pit, small remnants of the camper's presence were discovered: a glove, a lightweight utensil, and a ground sheet half folded. None offered a directional clue or a clear explanation, yet each confirmed that the camper had been present, performing ordinary tasks. Analysts noted the contradiction inherent in the findings. The site conveyed deliberate human activity while simultaneously offering no evidence of departure or path forward. Investigators documented every detail meticulously, understanding that in high-altitude plateau conditions, even minimal shifts in wind, temperature, and moisture could erase footprints and disrupt perception. The environment itself seemed to conspire with mystery. In multiple areas of the plateau, investigators observed soil that retained moisture unevenly, creating isolated spots where surface impressions could momentarily form before fading into the surrounding dryness. These micropatterns, common in high-altitude grasslands with uneven subsurface drainage, complicated the reading of ground traces and forced teams to slow their pace while scanning for fleeting imprints. In a few locations, faint depressions that resembled partial steps were found beside shallow clusters of sedge, yet none aligned into a coherent direction, reinforcing the idea that the terrain itself reacted differently from 1 square meter to the next. Such inconsistencies, though ordinary to those familiar with plateau ecology, introduced enough ambiguity to challenge even experienced trackers. Experts reviewing the incident emphasized several factors: the psychological and physiological effects of overnight exposure on open plateaus, the influence of low visibility and uniform terrain on orientation, and the speed at which environmental conditions could obscure evidence. While such conditions might explain minor disorientation, they could not fully account for the camper's complete absence. Comparisons with prior incidents along the Balkan Mountain Trails highlighted the plateau's unique hazards, distinct from dense forest or steep ridge routes, emphasizing how open landscapes can paradoxically amplify both visibility and invisibility, revealing nothing while suggesting presence. Careful observation, thorough documentation, and repeated search efforts failed to uncover the camper. The tent remained as it had been left, the fire pit cold, and all personal items accounted for yet undisturbed. Each revisit to the site reinforced the same paradox. The plateau preserved the environment precisely as it had been, yet removed the person who had interacted with it. In local forestry and mountaineering records, the disappearance is cited not only for its unusual circumstances, but for the psychological tension it produces. A place that appears entirely ordinary yet conceals the inexplicable. The Chumerna Plateau endures in collective memory as a wide, empty expanse, where wind, light, and shadow interact in ways that can render human presence temporary or illusory. Visitors today note the vast horizon, the subtle curves of ridges, and the deceptive uniformity of low rises, sensing the quiet power of the plateau to obscure and challenge perception. In this place, familiarity provides little reassurance, and the ordinary act of setting a tent can lead to extraordinary mystery. When the wind sweeps across the plateau, bending grasses and carrying distant echoes, it carries the quiet certainty that one camper simply ceased to exist, where nothing seemed capable of concealment. The missing visitor at Raysko Praskalo waterfall. Spray from Raysko Praskalo fell in a fine veil over rocks and moss, blurring the path and carrying distant echoes that seemed to mislead the eye. The visitor had arrived mid-morning, intent on exploring the waterfall's base and capturing its cascading flow on camera. Yet within hours, what began as a routine hike became one of the more perplexing incidents along the Balkan Mountain Trails. The roar of the water dominated the soundscape, mingling with the hiss of mist against leaves and the faint creak of narrow bridges spanning slippery stone. Even with well-marked trails leading from the main viewing platform, the combination of water, shadow, and reflection created an environment in which orientation became uncertain, making it all too easy for someone to diverge from visible paths without immediate notice. The approach paths were deceptively simple, lined with moss-covered rocks and interspersed with wooden walkways that showed wear from years of visitors. Small rivulets ran across the stone steps, pooling in depressions and producing reflective surfaces that caught sunlight at unexpected angles. The visitor advanced carefully, noting each landmark, yet every familiar feature seemed mutable in the shifting light, fog and spray. Where one expected a steady incline, a hidden dip or slippery ledge altered footing. Where one expected a clear marker, the cascading water obscured its visibility. Such subtle environmental tricks created tension without apparent threat, leaving even attentive hikers vulnerable to error. Loose stones shifted underfoot, their muted clatter temporarily masked by the waterfall's roar. Mist clung to the rocks and vegetation, forming droplets that refracted light and cast ghostly images across the narrow trail. Occasionally the visitor paused, attempting to reconcile memory with observation, yet each pause offered only partial clarity. The auditory landscape added to the challenge. Every sound bounced, distorted, or disappeared entirely as the water consumed it. Observers would later note that these factors created a sensory dissonance that could cause even a cautious hiker to misjudge distance and direction, further complicating search efforts once the visitor vanished. Stepping onto a narrow side path that branched from the main trail, the visitor leaned carefully against a rock wall, photographing the waterfall from a new angle. The ledge was uneven and slick, yet offered a unique perspective on the cascade. As the visitor moved, mist coated camera lenses, creating hazy images in which the surrounding cliffs appeared closer or farther than they were, while the sound of water ricocheted against walls in unpredictable patterns. A few small birds fluttered between crevices, their sudden movement startling in the echo-filled air. Every careful motion was met with an environment that subtly redefined space and expectation, making a simple detour seem far more complex. Beneath the waterfall, natural pools and shallow channels carved into the limestone glistened with unexpected clarity, revealing a landscape both inviting and deceptive. These pools, often used by hikers to rest or refill water containers, were deceptively deep in certain spots and connected by slippery stone ridges barely visible under the constant spray. Local guides later noted that even experienced visitors sometimes misjudged the depth and spacing of these formations, occasionally stepping into ankle-deep water that suddenly became thigh-deep. Small currents, created by runoff from the upper cascades, could redirect a person's path toward hidden crevices or moss-covered ledges, increasing the likelihood of missteps. Geological surveys confirm that the limestone beneath the waterfall is highly porous and uneven, with natural fissures that can conceal both water flow and footing hazards. These details underscore the subtle physical dangers that may have contributed to the visitor's disappearance, offering insight without relying on speculation or dramatization. From a nearby observation platform, other hikers noted the visitor's progress, watching as a figure moved along the side trail and then disappeared behind a curtain of mist. Their last confirmed sighting occurred minutes later, when the visitor paused on a small outcrop, seemingly scanning the cascading water. After that, no one saw movement, and no sound carried beyond the waterfall's ceaseless roar. Search teams would later reconstruct the visitors' steps using a combination of trail cameras and witness accounts, establishing the last reliable markers while emphasizing the unpredictability of the terrain. Immediate search efforts involved retracing the side trail and inspecting nearby ledges for fallen hikers or signs of a slip. Rangers and volunteers combed both the rocky path and adjacent forested slopes, mindful that the waterfall's spray made surfaces treacherously slick and that fog could conceal depressions or narrow crevices. The combination of moisture, uneven footing and reflective surfaces disrupted perception, often making searchers question whether they had passed the correct spot. Even experienced personnel noted that the waterfall created an optical environment capable of misleading both eye and mind, complicating rescue attempts. Tiny remnants were discovered, adding to the enigma without clarifying the situation. A small water bottle was recovered near the trail's edge, partially buried under leaves. A camera lens cap rested on a rock, streaked with mist. A footprint in mud led briefly toward a side path before disappearing entirely. Each item confirmed the visitor's presence while simultaneously emphasizing the absence of continuity. No path forward, no indication of a misstep or accident. Investigators highlighted the contradiction inherent in such findings. Ordinary objects suggested routine activity, yet the person who had handled them could not be located, leaving the landscape's apparent normalcy to mask the disappearance. Experts reviewed the terrain, noting the waterfall's specific hazards: rapidly changing light patterns, mist-induced illusions, slippery rocks, and narrow side trails that combined to create a disorienting environment. While most visitors navigated the area without incident, any momentary lapse in attention or misjudgment could become consequential. Comparisons with previous Balkan Mountain Trails cases highlighted how environmental factors, not only dense forests or steep ridges, could play an active role in unexplained disappearances. In this instance, Raysko praskalo's beauty and accessibility concealed hazards capable of rendering a human presence fleeting and unreliable. Thorough searches, including careful sweeps along cliffs, forested banks and secondary paths, failed to locate the missing visitor. Every subsequent observation confirmed the area's complexity. Rocks appeared different under shifting light, mist concealed depressions and ledges, and the waterfall's roar drowned subtle sounds that might have aided rescue. Trail cameras, when reviewed later, showed the visitor entering the side path, but no subsequent frame provided clarity on what happened beyond that point. The environment itself seemed to obscure rather than reveal, transforming a straightforward hike into a mystery resistant to resolution. Raysko praskalo remains visually spectacular, its cascading waters drawing thousands each year, yet it is a location where the ordinary and the extraordinary meet in subtle ways. Visitors today speak of mist that disorients, paths that seem to shift underfoot, and the sudden disappearance of familiar shapes behind curtains of spray. The incident continues to be cited in local records not as an anomaly of recklessness, but as a reminder that natural beauty can conceal danger, perception can fail, and a single human can vanish in plain sight. The waterfall has thundered for centuries, yet within its mist and shadows lingers the quiet memory of one who stepped into its spray and was never seen again. The Stara Reka Gorge Day hiker. The gorge opened suddenly, walls rising steeply on either side, channeling sunlight into sharp, moving beams that fractured the forested floor below. A day hiker entered Stara Reka Gorge that morning, following a well-known trail that hugged the river's edge, yet within hours the familiar path became a corridor of disorientation and unease. The roar of rushing water filled the narrow canyon, bouncing off stone cliffs to create echoes that distorted both direction and distance. Shallow pools reflected the sunlight in unpredictable ways, and jagged rocks jutted from the riverbanks, forming irregular stepping points that seemed to shift with every glance. Although the trail was mapped and regularly maintained, the gorge's vertical confinement made every movement deliberate, each step fraught with uncertainty, and the hiker's presence soon merged with the gorge itself in ways that would frustrate even the most experienced searchers. Every footfall required care. Narrow ledges slick with moisture and moss demanded attention, and sudden drops in terrain appeared without warning, hidden behind vegetation or shadowed crevices. The river's current surged in confined channels, its sound magnified by the walls that rose sharply on either side, masking the soft crunch of stones underfoot. Rocks that appeared stable often shifted when pressed, sending vibrations up the legs and forcing the hiker to pause, reassess, and plan the next movement. Although the gorge extended only a few kilometers, its uneven surfaces and limited escape points transformed a routine day hike into a spatial puzzle where misjudgment could have immediate consequences. The hiker paused at a narrow bend where the river widened slightly, exposing a series of stepping stones partially submerged. The water flowed with surprising force here, its shallow surface hiding the true depth of eddies and channels. Moss coated each stone, reducing traction, while the reflective surface of the water created illusions of continuity between rocks that were in fact separated by deep pockets. Even small currents shifted footing subtly, sometimes forcing a misstep or a hesitant leap. Each careful movement emphasized how the gorge's confined topography could distort perception, a characteristic that would later make reconstructing the hiker's path nearly impossible. Along certain stretches, the gorge's cliffs were pocked with natural niches and overhangs that captured wind and water in unpredictable ways, creating microcurrents and sudden gusts that shifted leaves and small debris across the trail. Hikers passing through these niches often experienced minor but disorienting changes in footing, as damp leaves could slide or collect in shallow depressions, masking uneven stone. Occasional water seepage from the cliffs above formed small trickles, further slicking the already treacherous path. Geologists note that such microenvironments develop from long-term erosion of the limestone walls, producing hidden crevices and alcoves that are easily overlooked. For the day hiker, these subtle natural phenomena could have obscured trail continuity, misleading perception of both distance and direction. Combined with the gorge's echoing acoustics and shifting shadows, these features contributed to an environment capable of temporarily erasing the hiker's presence, even along a frequently travelled path. Sound played tricks on perception. Every rustle of leaves, drip of water, or distant bird call ricocheted along the canyon walls, producing multiple echoes that misled the ear. The hiker occasionally turned toward a noise, only to find nothing, while the rushing river masked other subtler sounds that might have indicated changes in terrain. Vertical shadows moved constantly across the walls, merging with vegetation to create false contours and illusions of ledges or gaps. In such an environment, estimating distance became unreliable, and even a confident navigator could feel unexpectedly unmoored. The last confirmed sighting occurred near a bend where the gorge narrowed sharply. The hiker appeared to be adjusting a backpack strap while pausing to evaluate the next section of trail, glancing across shallow rock pools and patches of uneven stone. From a nearby observation point, other visitors noted the figure moving cautiously along a ledge, but disappearing briefly behind the wall's sudden jut before emerging a moment later. Beyond this point, the path twisted out of sight, and the hiker vanished into a combination of shadow, cliff, and echoing water that would obscure every subsequent movement. Once the disappearance was reported, search teams moved quickly, retracing the trail and confronting the gorge's vertical obstacles. Rope teams scaled small cliffs, inspecting hidden ledges and narrow alcoves that could conceal a person, while riverbanks were examined for footprints or disturbed stones. Even experienced personnel found the terrain deceptive. Steep, moss-covered rocks gave way to sudden drops, and the vertical walls magnified water noise, making coordination difficult. Every inspection revealed that the gorge could quickly erase human presence, leaving searchers uncertain whether they had passed the correct spot or missed it entirely. A single trekking pole was discovered lodged in river debris, its strap frayed and partially submerged. Footprints appeared on patches of sandy soil, abruptly ending at a rocky outcrop, and vegetation along the trail showed minor disturbances consistent with passage, but provided no clear direction. Each finding confirmed the hiker's presence while emphasizing the absence of continuity. The trail seemed to fold back on itself, erasing evidence in a way that made the gorge appear both familiar and unknowable. Geological surveys highlight the Stara Reka Gorge's unique characteristics. Its narrow channeling and limestone composition contribute to uneven footing, hidden fissures, and occasional overhangs that create false trails. The river's erosive power continually reshapes stones and sediment, sometimes within hours, further complicating navigation. Experts emphasize that in confined gorges, even brief distractions can result in lost footing, while echoing sounds and irregular shadows affect judgment and perception. These factors illustrate how the gorge itself can serve as an active, sometimes imperceptible participant in a disappearance, influencing human action without any extraordinary forces. As hours passed with no further trace, searchers considered the gorge's environmental complexity as a key factor in the day hiker's disappearance. Patterns of water flow, shadow, and trail geometry were mapped and analysed, yet no conclusive path forward emerged. The hiker's last known location aligned with a section where multiple side crevices branched off the main trail, each potentially concealing a step off the visible path. Observers noted that even small deviations from the main route could result in rapid loss of orientation, particularly under the combination of vertical confinement, rushing water, and echoing sound. The gorge appeared capable of both preserving the appearance of order and obscuring any meaningful trace of movement. Multiple search efforts across several days failed to uncover any additional evidence. Rocks, pools, and shadowed alcoves concealed any remaining signs of passage, leaving the river and cliffs unchanged, yet subtly transformed by the hiker's fleeting presence. Local hikers continue to traverse the gorge with caution, aware of its narrow passages, shifting water patterns, and unpredictable acoustics. While Stara Reka Gorge remains a scenic route, its combination of confinement, elevation changes, and water flow creates a setting in which even a short familiar trail can transform into a zone of uncertainty. The river continues its ceaseless descent through the gorge, but its echoing walls still carry the unaccounted passage of a day hiker who stepped into its depths and vanished without a trace. The 2-day missing tourist near Kotel. The trail near Kotel stretched outward in gentle curves, a familiar path through low hills dotted with forest groves and open meadows that had welcomed countless day hikers. On this particular morning, a tourist set out with the expectation of a straightforward trek, unaware that the Balkan Mountain Trails had a history of travellers vanishing under seemingly ordinary circumstances. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss and scattered leaves, creating a pattern that shifted as the hiker advanced. Small birds darted between branches, their calls echoing faintly across the meadows and occasionally distorting in the wind. The air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen pine needles, subtly hinting at the moisture retained in shaded depressions. Initially, every step seemed deliberate and measured, yet within the first hour, subtle ambiguities in trail markers and the merging of open meadows with forest edges began to challenge perception, setting the stage for a disappearance that would stretch across 2 days. The tourists followed the painted trail markers with apparent confidence, white rectangles punctuating tree trunks, stone cairns arranged at intervals, and small wooden posts rising intermittently along the meadow edges. The path wound through patches of conifer and oak, with sporadic clusters of wildflowers that shifted attention and occasionally concealed minor depressions in the soil. Even slight changes in ground elevation, barely perceptible at first, accumulated over hours into misjudgments in footing and direction. Shallow streams intersected the trail at irregular intervals, their waters cool and clear, yet capable of leaving faint, easily washed away footprints. Observers familiar with Kotel's terrain note that such minor features can create subtle but cumulative disorientation over extended travel, even for hikers accustomed to the area. By mid-morning, disorientation had begun to take hold. Meadows and groves blurred together, shadows shifted as sunlight moved across the hills, and previously noted boulders and trees appeared in unexpected positions. Landmarks seemed to repeat, yet distances felt inconsistent, fostering a quiet uncertainty that grew with every step. At one point, a thin wisp of fog rolled through that meadow, barely perceptible yet enough to alter depth perception and force a pause. Such microclimatic changes are common in Kotel, where morning mist can linger even past mid-morning in low-lying areas, creating a transient labyrinth of shadows and shapes that confound orientation. Small signs of passage emerged along the way, footprints pressed lightly into soft soil, a twig bent at an unusual angle, disturbed moss along the edge of a trail. None offered definitive guidance. A minor stream crossing left faint impressions in wet sand, only for these to vanish downstream where flowing water scoured the riverbed. Broken branches suggested movement through brush, yet repeated patterns led to uncertainty about which tracks belonged to the tourist. Local guides emphasised that Kotel's interspersed meadows and forest edges can render such evidence ephemeral, making it difficult to reconstruct a hiker's exact course once a trail is partially obscured. As evening approached, the tourists sought a sheltered grove for rest, unaware that uneven ground and residual moisture would complicate comfort and sleep. The forest floor was soft but cold, and low branches brushed against clothing and skin, creating minor irritation that accumulated over hours of inactivity. Wildlife calls, distant and sporadic, filled the space between trees, reinforcing a sense of isolation. Even in calm conditions, the combination of ambient sound, forest density, and subtle deviation from the trail produced a disorienting effect, illustrating how ordinary terrain can quickly feel unfamiliar and threatening. Search teams mobilized shortly after dusk, responding to a delayed return report. Guides with intimate knowledge of the area assessed trails, meadows, and forested edges, while small units tracked likely paths based on known hiker behavior and prior incidents in Kotel. Canine units were deployed where feasible, yet scent trails became unreliable as the tourist traversed meadows, shallow streams, and areas frequented by wildlife. Rescue coordinators noted that even with local guides, the meadows and forests near Kotel presented visual ambiguity. Repeated patterns in tree spacing, colour, and texture challenged the human eye, rendering simple distances deceptive. Each attempted search segment revealed subtle deviations from the expected trail, requiring teams to reassess positions frequently. Through the night and into the following morning, the tourists' wandering became increasingly erratic. Meadows appeared to repeat themselves, forest edges folded back unexpectedly, and minor streams offered crossings that seemed familiar but led to entirely new clearings. Occasional glimpses of trail markers were misinterpreted, creating loops of walking that carried the tourist further from known points. Signs of wildlife activity, fallen twigs from small mammals, birds flying in repeated loops, added further uncertainty. The hiker occasionally mistook these for evidence of human passage, altering decisions about direction and pause points, demonstrating how natural activity can contribute to prolonged wandering even in otherwise safe terrain. By the second day, the tourist contended with growing fatigue and environmental complexity. Sunlight filtering through the canopy produced illusions of paths continuing into forested areas where none existed. Slight variations in slope and the coloration of vegetation created impressions of hills or open spaces that were, in fact, shadows or minor depressions. In repeated instances, the hiker believed familiar landmarks appeared only to realize they were deceptive twins of previously passed trees or rocks. Each misperception compounded the time spent wandering, emphasizing how even a hiker with average skill could become disoriented over 2 days without extraordinary conditions. A narrow, overgrown side path branched sharply from the main trail, barely marked by a moss-covered wooden sign, and it was on the second morning that the tourist came upon it. The path led into a small clearing where a seasonal stream wound through damp soil and scattered boulders jutted irregularly from the earth, creating a patchwork of obstacles that the hiker had to navigate with caution. Birdsong echoed faintly from nearby trees, yet the sound seemed distorted by the slight incline and dense undergrowth, making orientation more difficult. The tourist paused repeatedly, unsure whether the clearing was familiar or a deviation, retracing steps several times before choosing a direction, an experience that exemplified how minor side paths and subtle topographical changes in Kotel can extend a hiker's absence despite calm conditions. Several kilometers from where the trek began, the tourist was ultimately located in a shallow grove of mixed forest. Physically unharmed but mentally fatigued, the hiker exhibited signs of confusion, consistent with prolonged wandering and repeated misjudgments of direction. Footprints, minor disturbances in vegetation, and temporary resting spots across meadows and forest edges provided a clear record of movement, illustrating how environmental complexity and psychological factors combined to create a multi-day disappearance. Rescue teams concluded that gradual misreading of trail markers, deceptive terrain features, fluctuating light conditions, and cumulative fatigue accounted for the extended absence, highlighting how even well-marked familiar paths in Kotel can become confusing and isolating. The tourist returned safely, but the meadows and forest edges near Kotel retained a quiet, unsettling ambiguity, a reminder that familiar trails can conceal days of wandering within their deceptively simple curves. The lost hiker recovered on Stara planina's slopes. A faint misalignment in the trail markers caught the hiker's attention just as the forest seemed to close in, folding familiar paths into a shifting mosaic of moss and stone. The journey had begun along a known route, one that hikers in the region frequently followed, yet subtle deviations soon created uncertainty. Stara planina's slopes, with their dense conifer stands interspersed with limestone outcrops and shallow gullies, offered both beauty and disorientation. As the hiker advanced, sunlight through the canopy illuminated patches of moss and exposed rock, yet shadows shifted rapidly, creating an effect of movement where none existed. Moments of confidence gave way to hesitation, each step measured and tentative as the realization grew that the path ahead no longer matched memory or maps. The hiker's first indication that a serious misstep had occurred was a small cairn that seemed slightly askew, a detail that might have gone unnoticed on any other day but felt critical in the quiet, isolated environment of Stara planina. Limestone outcrops jutted sharply from the slope, their surfaces slick from early morning dew, and the soil between them was uneven, demanding careful attention to each step. These formations were typical of the northern slopes, where water runoff over centuries had carved jagged edges and small ridges into the softer stone. Occasional patches of grass and low shrubs grew in the depressions, their roots clinging to thin soil and providing only limited traction. Navigating the terrain required constant awareness, and even a brief lapse could result in a misstep or a momentary loss of orientation. Small streams intersected the hillside, their water clear and cold, running along channels that shifted slightly with rainfall, creating areas of damp earth that left ephemeral footprints. The hiker moved cautiously, noting each depression, every exposed rock, aware that the smallest detail might later serve as a clue to direction or error. Seasonal streams cut across the hillside in shallow channels, their waters clear but noisy enough to distort the direction of distant bird calls and the faint rustle of leaves. The wind, minimal yet perceptible, carried sound unevenly through the dense conifers, making it difficult to judge the location of wildlife or other forest markers. The hiker's eyes sought familiar patterns, tree spacing, moss on trunks, rock arrangements, but even these proved unreliable. A fallen log that had served as a reference point on prior treks now appeared slightly displaced, whether by natural erosion or perceptual error. As hours passed, the repetition of visual cues combined with subtle variations in topography contributed to mounting disorientation, illustrating how quickly even an experienced hiker could become lost on these slopes. Sunlight filtering through dense conifers produced illusions of movement, causing the hiker to hesitate, unsure whether a familiar boulder was where it should be or simply a trick of light and shadow. Shadows elongated across the mossy floor, and bright patches of sunlight created false impressions of open paths. At times, the hiker would advance, confident in a chosen direction, only to find a small depression or a narrow ridge redirecting progress in unanticipated ways. These micro-variations, imperceptible on first glance, accumulated into hours of wandering, slowly eroding certainty. Each moment required recalibration of steps, a constant negotiation with the terrain that revealed both its beauty and its subtle capacity for concealment. Each repetition of similar trees and undergrowth added to the sense of unreality, stretching minutes into hours and testing the hiker's patience and memory of the trail. Patterns repeated across ridges and gullies, making previously passed areas indistinguishable from those ahead. Moss-covered boulders, thin streams, and clusters of ferns mirrored each other so closely that mental mapping became unreliable. The hiker paused frequently, attempting to reconstruct the route using distant peaks or distant landmarks, yet even these proved deceptive. Faint rustles, bird calls, and distant water sounds contributed to a perception of movement that was often illusory, and exhaustion began to affect judgment, subtly influencing choices of direction and rest spots. Search teams approached from multiple angles, using both local knowledge and GPS coordinates, yet the forest's subtle irregularities forced constant adjustment and recalibration of search zones. Rescuers relied on familiarity with the terrain, noting likely resting points, water crossings, and areas where trail markers were prone to fading or displacement. Their methodical approach balanced thorough coverage with efficiency, yet each segment revealed challenges inherent to Stara planina: ridges that looped unexpectedly, gullies that concealed views of the surrounding landscape, and dense undergrowth that reduced visibility to mere meters. Communication among teams was frequent, each update influencing the next search trajectory as they tried to anticipate the hikers' movements and compensate for the effects of fatigue and confusion. Dogs tracing faint scents found their paths interrupted by streams and fallen logs, requiring handlers to interpret stops and hesitations carefully as the forest muffled otherwise clear signals. Canine units moved deliberately along probable routes, pausing at scent intensities that indicated either movement or environmental interference. The handlers noted subtle changes: disturbed moss, broken twigs, and flattened grass, all contributing to the reconstruction of the hiker's path. Despite these signs, the forest remained an active participant, masking clues with its natural complexity and requiring meticulous interpretation. The interplay of wildlife, terrain, and weather amplified the difficulty, and even small variations in temperature and wind altered the scent patterns, extending the time required to locate the missing individual. Steep gullies and narrow ridges slowed progress for the rescuers, and the interplay of light and shadow on jagged limestone made visual confirmation of tracks intermittent at best. At times, the trail appeared unmistakable, only to dissolve into a confusing mixture of undergrowth and stone. Rescuers were compelled to pause frequently, scanning for subtle signs of passage: flattened ferns, slightly shifted stones, or faint impressions on damp earth. Each clue had to be weighed carefully, as the terrain could create natural distortions that mimicked human activity. Even with extensive experience, the teams confronted an environment that could momentarily erase or mislead perception, reinforcing the precarious nature of search operations in these northern slopes. A sudden movement beneath a low branch caught a rescuer's eye, revealing the hiker crouched and exhausted, yet alert enough to recognize voices that had been faint and distant moments before. The hiker's relief was immediate, though tempered by fatigue and disorientation accumulated over hours of wandering. Physical exhaustion manifested in slow steps, shallow breaths, and a momentary struggle to regain composure. Psychological relief mingled with lingering uncertainty as the hiker attempted to reconcile the experience of losing orientation with the familiar terrain of Stara planina. The rescue team guided the individual along safer terrain, noting the locations of minor obstacles and ensuring that the hiker's path out of the dense forest was secure and controlled. Once reunited with the search team, the hiker's recollection of distances and landmarks was imprecise, a testament to how quickly Stara planina's slopes can warp perception even under favourable weather and trail conditions. Small, repeated environmental cues had contributed to confusion, while micro-topographical changes and ephemeral streams reinforced uncertainty. The hiker described streams appearing wider or narrower than memory suggested, boulders seeming closer or farther away, and familiar ridges blending with unfamiliar slopes. Even with clear maps, the interplay of terrain, light, and perception had created an experience that was immersive, isolating, and ultimately disorienting, offering insight into how the forest and slopes can silently manipulate orientation and time. The hiker's return offered no resolution to the forest itself, whose slopes remained inscrutable, preserving subtle distortions and unseen paths that might claim another traveller without warning. The elderly traveller rescued near Tvarditsa. The forest near Tvarditsa was hushed under an overcast sky, where the distant ridgelines blurred into low clouds, and the scent of damp soil rose from the thick undergrowth. Amid the dense trees and narrow trails, an unexpected disappearance on the Balkan Mountain Trails revealed how even brief excursions could turn perilous. Though the route was familiar to locals and considered relatively safe, subtle changes in terrain and weather could quickly transform a short walk into an ordeal, and in this instance, the forest seemed to hold its presence in quiet anticipation. Small streams that usually glinted under sunlight now appeared muted, their surfaces reflecting the diffuse grey light, while the low canopy allowed only fragmented glimpses of the sky above. Fallen leaves formed a mosaic across the uneven path, and the occasional trickle of water over hidden rocks created a muted rhythm that suggested movement yet concealed its source. The forest floor was littered with irregularities, exposed roots, patches of moss, and depressions that could easily trip a careless foot. Birds called sporadically from concealed perches, their movements almost imperceptible, and the distant hum of insects mingled with the faint sound of the wind threading through the branches. These ordinary details, so often overlooked, became crucial elements in understanding how the terrain could disorient someone accustomed to its patterns. Shadows shifted with the clouded light, and familiar tree formations seemed subtly altered, producing a quiet unease that accumulated with each step along the slopes. What appeared at first glance to be a straight stretch of trail could curve unexpectedly, obscured by undergrowth or fallen branches, and landmarks that had guided many previous walks now seemed distorted or absent. The combination of visual repetition and environmental ambiguity created a subtle dissonance in perception, one that could easily lead even an experienced local to second-guess familiar directions. Slopes that appeared gentle from a distance revealed hidden gullies, tangled roots, and uneven ground that demanded constant attention to avoid missteps. Small inclines became deceptively steep as the path descended into shaded hollows, and the quiet, almost imperceptible variations in the undergrowth made the trail seem longer and more intricate than maps or prior experience suggested. Every careful step required observation and judgment, and each miscalculation had the potential to delay progress or obscure the traveller's sense of orientation. Efforts to locate familiar trail markers proved frustrating as small deviations in path layout caused familiar points to seem unfamiliar and unreliable. Painted blazes on trees could appear faded or partially hidden, while footpaths that had seemed distinct at the start became indistinguishable from minor clearings nearby. Rocks, once used as reference points, were sometimes covered in moss or moved by runoff, further complicating the traveller's attempt to navigate effectively. The forest, though not actively hostile, had the quiet power to reshape perception, masking the normal cues that might otherwise prevent disorientation. Local authorities and neighbours quickly organised a search, moving systematically through the ridges and forested patches while relying on experience and intuition to anticipate the traveller's likely route. Teams divided across the slope, calling out and listening for responses, while others attempted to trace footprints in areas where the soil retained impressions. Radio coordination allowed the groups to share observations, noting subtle disturbances in leaf litter, snapped twigs, or slightly shifted vegetation that could indicate movement. The dense forest limited visibility, and every patch of undergrowth had to be scanned carefully, highlighting the meticulous nature of search operations in Stara planina. Ridges overlooked by the rescue teams concealed microhabitats of ferns and moss that could obscure footprints and other subtle traces, challenging even seasoned searchers to distinguish between natural irregularities and evidence of passage. Small depressions in the soil collected water from overnight rain, creating miniature streams that washed away impressions almost as quickly as they were made, while fallen leaves and twigs shifted under the faintest breeze, further masking any sign of movement. The forest, though familiar in the general layout, presented a constantly changing surface that required scrutiny at every step, searching as much a test of patience as of skill. Dense undergrowth and intermittent rocky outcrops slowed progress, requiring careful negotiation and constant observation of subtle traces left along the forest floor. Searchers had to move deliberately, often crouching or stepping sideways to maintain balance, as the combination of slopes, hidden roots, and loose soil rendered rapid movement hazardous. While some clearings provided brief respite and orientation, the network of ravines and minor gullies complicated efforts to establish a consistent search pattern, and the rescuers' attention was drawn repeatedly to the most minor signs of passage, no matter how fleeting. Further along the search route, pockets of colder air pooled in shallow hollows, creating abrupt shifts in temperature that momentarily halted the rescuers as they adjusted to the unexpected chill. Moisture lingered in these depressions long after rainfall had passed, forming slick patches that glistened faintly beneath the muted daylight and required careful footing to navigate safely. In several spots, the faint smell of wet stone mixed with the broader scent of pine, signalling that hidden springs or seepage points were nearby, and these subtle environmental cues reminded the teams that the forest held countless small variables capable of complicating even routine movement. Unexpectedly, a sudden rise in the wind rattled loose branches, masking faint calls and the subtle crunch of footsteps, forcing searchers to rely on instinct and careful observation rather than sound alone. The gusts carried the scent of wet earth and pine deeper into the forest, and at times the rustle of leaves seemed to imitate human movement, creating fleeting illusions that distracted and slowed progress. Even experienced rescuers noted how the combination of variable light, shifting shadows, and ephemeral sounds could turn the familiar slopes into a labyrinth of uncertainty, emphasizing the forest's quiet, pervasive influence over those who traversed it. A faint glimmer of reflective material among the leaves finally caught a rescuer's eye, revealing the traveller resting on a slight incline, fatigued yet conscious. Careful approach allowed the searchers to confirm that the individual had endured the disorienting terrain without serious injury, though exhaustion and subtle hypothermia required immediate attention. The traveller's description of the path matched neither memory nor expectations, citing sections where trail markers seemed altered and forest features that appeared to shift with perspective. These inconsistencies underscored the forest's quiet authority, demonstrating that even short distances on familiar terrain could challenge cognition and perception. Even after the ordeal, the forest retained its quiet authority, reminding both the rescued individual and the searchers that perception and terrain could easily confound even the most experienced. The slopes remained densely vegetated, with each bend and clearing offering new angles and shadows that subtly altered spatial judgment. Footprints, broken twigs, and disturbed leaf litter were quickly reclaimed by the environment, leaving little evidence for casual observers. Such conditions rendered the memory of the traveller's walk both remarkable and enigmatic, a case study in how familiarity does not guarantee safety in the variable and layered environment of the Balkan Mountains. The slopes near Tvarditsa remained enigmatic, with hidden bends and shadowed clearings where the forest could still quietly challenge anyone who wandered within it. The missing boy of Shipka Pass, sunlight filtered unevenly through the tall firs along Shipka Pass, casting patches of warmth that made the boy's familiar trail seem at once welcoming and strangely fragmented. What had been a routine family outing unfolded like a scene of subtle anomalies. The moss-covered rocks appeared larger, the gaps between trees wider, and a narrow side trail he'd passed countless times seemed to extend farther than memory allowed. The Balkan Mountain Trails had long been celebrated for their accessible paths, yet even well-trodden routes could conceal unseen dangers, and the incident at Shipka Pass would soon demonstrate just how quickly familiarity could turn deceptive. Voices echoed faintly from the nearby path where his parents walked, the gentle sound of conversation mingling with the distant rush of a mountain stream. The boy had followed the marked trail many times, noting the small cairns and painted blazes that guided hikers along the ridge. Streams cut shallow channels through the soil, and fallen leaves provided a soft carpet over exposed roots. For a young child, these were landmarks, each rock and tree serving as a point of reference. But even the most reliable markers could mislead when perceived from a slightly different angle or in changing light. He paused at a fork in the trail, certain he had passed this junction before, yet the markers seemed unfamiliar, and the forest beyond held an unexpected shadow. A thin mist clung to the lower ground, softening the outlines of the path, and the sound of water from the ravine below seemed louder than before, disorienting in its sudden proximity. Moments that might have felt inconsequential to an adult took on heightened significance in his awareness, each choice of direction carrying consequences he could not yet comprehend. Beyond the fork, the slope was crossed by sunlight filtered through unsettled clouds, creating shifting bands of light and dark that flowed over the ground and subtly transformed the path from moment to moment. In areas where fir branches overlapped, the light fractured into narrow beams that illuminated only fragments of the terrain, an exposed root here, a patch of lichen there, leaving the remaining sections in muted half-light. For a child navigating these inconsistencies, the trail seemed to change character each time he blinked, as though familiar features were sliding in and out of view. Such transient contrasts, documented by hikers in densely forested sections of Shipka Pass, contemporarily distort depth and distance, turning an ordinary slope into a shifting mosaic of unclear choices. Birdsong and rustling leaves created a dissonant pattern of movement and sound, making it difficult to gauge distance or direction as he advanced further along the slope. The forest floor, littered with pine needles and scattered branches, produced no definitive echo of footsteps, and the shadows of tall trees elongated in unpredictable ways as the sun shifted across the sky. Even minor variations in terrain, a sudden dip, a small rise, or a patch of dense undergrowth could mask or distort perception, leading him deeper into a confusing network of trails. A sudden quiet fell over the path behind him, and when he turned, The absence of familiar figures became undeniable, signalling the first true sense of alarm. Calls from his family carried only intermittently, bouncing between tree trunks and rocks, and each fleeting sound seemed to originate from multiple directions, offering no certainty. Panic began to rise, tempered by the boy's instinctive knowledge to stay on the trail, yet the very paths meant to guide him now seemed to resist clarity. Neighbours and hikers quickly gathered, forming an impromptu line along the forest edge, their voices calling out while rescue dogs sniffed the ground for a trace of the boy's passage. Local authorities coordinated the initial response, deploying teams along accessible slopes, ridge lines, and minor clearings where he might have paused or rested. Every team carried radios, flashlights, and basic first aid equipment, and volunteers were instructed to move slowly and systematically, knowing that a child's footprints could be easily missed amid fallen leaves and shifting soil. Steep ravines and rocky outcrops interrupted the flow of the search, each step requiring careful attention to avoid missteps that could further complicate locating him. Narrow gullies funneled water during rainfall, creating temporary streams that washed away impressions, while loose stones and soil destabilized the footing of searchers. Even areas that appeared open and navigable could conceal hidden dips or moss-covered rocks, and the combination of elevation changes and undergrowth meant that every team member had to balance speed with caution. A small red scarf caught on a low branch offered the first tangible evidence of his path, providing rescuers a fleeting connection to his movements through the dense undergrowth. From there, teams traced faint footprints, noting where the boy had stepped over exposed roots or around small logs. The scarf's fibres, slightly damp from morning dew, suggested that he had lingered at the spot for a brief moment, perhaps uncertain which direction to take next. Each discovery required careful documentation to ensure the search remained coordinated and accurate. Nearby, the terrain revealed subtle traces of wildlife that may have both aided and confused the search. Small animal tracks crisscrossed the path, deer hoof prints pressed into the soil, and scattered bird feathers hinted at recent activity overhead. Rescuers had to distinguish between these natural markings and the boy's own passage, noting that even minor disturbances in foliage could obscure critical evidence. The interplay of animal movements and human footprints highlighted how the forest could mask or mimic a traveller's path, offering both challenge and guidance to those following the trail. Shadows softened, light dimmed, and gusts of wind scattered fallen leaves, while clouds rolled in unexpectedly above. Occasional rainfall added to the difficulty, turning the trail surface slick and muting the contrast between paths and surrounding vegetation. Search teams relied on careful observation and methodical scanning, knowing that the boy's small stature and the complex terrain could allow him to move unseen, even while remaining on the trail. He was eventually found crouched near a rocky outcrop, alert yet exhausted, his wide eyes reflecting both relief and the lingering confusion of the hours spent alone. Minor scratches along his arms and legs spoke to close encounters with brambles and low branches, yet there were no serious injuries. Rescuers noted the boy's cautious movements, as though every step required recalibration in response to an environment that had momentarily become alien. As rescuers guided him back along the uneven trail, every step revealed the subtle ways the terrain could deceive perception, turning a familiar path into a disorienting labyrinth. Small rises and dips, previously unnoticed, shifted the boy's line of sight. Shadows hid minor clearings. Even the sound of his own voice seemed absorbed by the surrounding trees. The team's presence restored safety, yet the forest retained an air of inscrutable depth that had tested both the boy's instincts and the skill of those searching for him. Even after returning to safety, he described the trail as though it had subtly rearranged itself, small slopes and tree lines appearing to shift while he moved. Parents and rescuers alike were struck by his vivid recounting of the landscape, which emphasized that perception, memory, and environment can interact in ways that make even short distances confusing. The incident reinforced how quickly the familiar can become enigmatic, and how vulnerable individuals can be when minute changes in terrain or light distort orientation. The boy's fleeting encounter with the forest left a quiet, lingering uncertainty that hinted at how quickly even the most familiar landscapes could conceal their secrets. The hiker who survived a night on Becklmetto. A cold wind crept over the ridge of Becklmetto Pass as dusk settled slowly upon the high peaks of the Balkan Mountains, and beneath that indifferent sky unfolded the story of a hiker who survived an entire night exposed near the saddle before dawn found him battered, disoriented, and forever changed. The pass itself occupies a lofty place, in the mountains at roughly 1,525 metres above sea level, one of the highest and most atmospheric points of the central Stara planina range, where ancient forests meet precipitous ridges and old paths carved by Roman feet still echo with history. From the southern slope, the stone and tarmac ribbon of Road 235 curves upward, twisting in a dozen hairpin turns from the Karlovo plain toward the summit ridge, where wind and weather can change without warning. Whether in summer or winter, the solitude of the pass and the ancient echo of the road lend Becklmetto a subtle gravitas, a sense of history wrapped in wild, indifferent terrain. The hiker arrived at Becklmetto in late summer, drawn by tales of sweeping ridgelines and far-reaching vistas. According to his later account, he set out from the small town of Troan, climbing the serpentine road and leaving the last vestiges of civilization behind as the forest thickened and the air cooled. He carried only a light backpack, confident in good weather and the well-marked summer trails branching from the pass toward cabins and shelters outside the main road. As evening fell, he decided to hike along a narrow spur that diverged from the main trail, perhaps to catch sunset over the peaks or simply to wander in solitude. The forest there was dense, the trees ancient beech and fir rising tall and dark, their limbs swaying quietly in a breeze that carried no sound but the faint rustle of needles. With each step the light dimmed, and outlines of trunks blurred until the world seemed to contract around him. He lost the trail. Venturing further into the forest, he noticed a faint scent of resin and moss lingering in the air, characteristic of Becklmetto's higher elevations, according to locals. These slopes are dotted with centuries-old beech trees whose roots twist over rocky soil, creating small natural labyrinths that can easily disorient hikers unfamiliar with the terrain. Cartographers note that minor shifts in elevation along these ridges can create optical illusions, where distant clearings appear closer or farther than they are, sometimes making familiar trail markers appear to move when viewed from different vantage points. Even the wind at these heights behaves unpredictably, funneling between trees and rocks in ways that can mask sounds or make approaching footsteps seem to come from the wrong direction. Confusion settled quickly. The markers painted on trees appeared to shift. What had pointed uphill moments ago now seemed to slope downward. Branches jutted at odd angles, casting shadows that merged into darkness. He tried to retrace his steps, but every turn revealed only unfamiliar shapes and forest. Night fell fully, bringing a chill that seeped into his bones. He realized he had no way to know which direction led back to Becklmetto, or even whether the pass lay north or south, up or down the slope. The forest seemed to swallow him completely. Alone under a black sky and amid towering trees, the hiker made a grim decision. He would not wander. He would find a place to hunker down and wait for dawn. He found a narrow ledge between two pines, pressed his back against a tree trunk and wrapped his arms around himself, shivering not just from cold but from fear. The night stretched long. Winds rose and fell, weaving through branches and rattling dead wood. Once a distant crack startled him, and for a moment he thought something moved beyond the reach of his flashlight. His breath came shallow, heart thudding, as he pictured unseen eyes gliding nearby. He tried to sleep, but sleep refused. The forest pressed close, dark and alive. Every sound became a signal, the whisper of wind, the groan of wood, the distant roll of stones. At one point he dozed briefly, only to jolt awake with the memory of a low murmur echoing through fogged-up vision. When dawn finally bled pale light through the trees, he emerged as one changed. He staggered through the undergrowth, senses sharp and body aching, until he stumbled onto a faint track, a narrow path that curved upward. He followed it with all the strength he had left. Hours later, he collapsed near the summit road of Becklmetto, trembling with cold and exhaustion. Passing motorists found him, dazed and incoherent, carrying only a small day pack with no sleeping gear or tent. They alerted local authorities, and a mountain rescue team arrived. He was dehydrated, disoriented, and reluctant to speak, but when he did, his voice shook as he described a night in which the forest seemed alive. shifting and deliberate in its confusion. Medical checks revealed no physical injury beyond severe exposure and dehydration, yet what the hiker recalled lacked any conventional explanation. There was no storm that night, no report of track closures, and no sign of unusual wildlife. The area was well known, heavily visited in summer, with clearly marked trails branching from Becklmetto toward huts, shelters, and the high ridges. Still, no hiker before or after claimed the forest had seemed to shift beneath their feet. Within days, the local path maintenance crews checked the diverging trail and found nothing. No fallen trees, no landslides, no missing markers. The blazes remained fixed, and the terrain was as solid as it had always been. Rumour rippled through small hiking communities around the Balkan range. Some whispered that the hiker had wandered into a pocket of disorientation common near the ridge, where altitude and pine-scented air war against human senses. Others said that in the fading lamplight, shadows might trick even the surest eyes and exaggerate a wrong turn into something more sinister. A few, gazing quietly at the dark forest, avoided the diverging trail altogether. Beyond speculation, there is one fact that cannot be denied. Despite grievous exposure, despite having no sleeping bag or shelter, despite the freezing night and isolated location, the hiker lived. He survived what should have been a fatal miscalculation in the remote heights above Becklmetto, where twisting roads, centuries-old paths and silent trees meet the void of sky in a vast, indifferent mountain. Some who later walked the main ridge trail said that on quiet nights, the wind around Becklmetto carries a strange breath, drifting among the trees and across the slopes toward the old Roman road. Whether memory, myth, or the mountain itself, no one can say. He returned home months later, quiet and changed. He avoided further hiking in the high ridges. He refused to speak about what he heard or saw that night, beyond cryptic comments about the forest rearranging itself. Local guides began to warn travellers, stay on the marked paths, avoid unknown spurs after dusk, and never underestimate how quickly the Balkan Mountains can turn their roads to disorientation. Now, whenever the sun sets over Becklmetto and the pass falls silent under gathering dark, there is a memory lingering in the wind of a lone hiker who survived a night that should not have belonged to any living soul. The lost traveller near Uzana meadows. The gentle slope of Uzana meadows stretched ahead, dotted with swaying grasses and scattered pines, and a lone traveller stepped carefully along paths that would soon defy all expectation, revealing how even familiar trails in the Balkan Mountains could lead to confusion. At roughly 1,200 metres above sea level, these high meadows are renowned for their sweeping vistas and quiet isolation, a place where pine and beech forests edge the open hills and small streams wind lazily through hidden hollows. Visitors are drawn by the subtle beauty and the ease of summer hiking, yet beneath the serene landscape lies a terrain that can challenge even experienced navigators. That day the traveller moved with a light pack and steady stride, unaware that the paths he relied on would soon appear to shift beneath him, leaving him disoriented in a place where human perception can betray even the clearest maps. Birdsong echoed faintly across the rolling hills, while hidden streams trickled over rocky beds, giving the impression that the landscape was alive with subtle motion beyond the traveller's immediate perception. The gentle wind carried scents of pine resin and damp earth, reminders of how altitude and moisture combine to create an air thick with sensory detail. From afar, the meadows might seem simple and open, but up close, small depressions, slight rises, and the dense growth along forest edges form natural corridors that subtly direct movement. Hikers often rely on painted blazes, wooden posts or cairns to navigate, yet even these markers require attention and constant reference in a landscape where similar formations repeat endlessly. The traveller, confident in his familiarity with summer trails, walked with a casual sense of assurance, unaware that the subtle interplay of slope, light and vegetation would soon challenge every expectation. Every painted wooden marker he encountered seemed slightly displaced, each blaze suggesting a direction that conflicted with the previous one, as if the terrain itself were nudging him off course. One moment, a post indicated a gentle turn toward a distant pine cluster. Moments later, the same marker appeared to point back along the trail he had just followed. Small variations in perspective, the rise and fall of the ground and the deceptive angles of the meadow made it nearly impossible to determine exact direction. The traveller paused, scanning the horizon and the trail ahead, but nothing aligned with memory. The sensation was subtle at first, a fleeting impression that he might have misread a marker or overlooked a turn, but as the minutes passed, the feeling grew insistent, a quiet unease settling in the chest and spine. Small patches of wildflowers, including rare mountain lilies and Balkan bellflowers, seemed to cluster in ways that subtly guided or misled the traveller, creating natural patterns that could suggest paths where none existed. Botanists note that these meadows often display uneven growth due to soil moisture and sunlight variations, and even minor shifts in terrain can cause the same species to appear in repeating clusters. To an observer moving quickly, these floral arrangements can give the impression of repeating landmarks, reinforcing the sense of disorientation as paths appear familiar, yet unfamiliar at the same time. Low ridgelines surrounding the meadow created subtle acoustic distortions, causing distant sounds to bend and travel unpredictably, and even experienced mountaineers note how voices, footsteps, or the rustle of animals can seem to originate from the wrong direction. Temperature shifts between shaded hollows and sunlit slopes create faint pockets of rising air, and these thermal contrasts can alter how sound carries, sometimes amplifying a distant noise while muffling something close. In such conditions, hikers who depend on auditory cues, like the hum of insects, the flow of water, or the movement of wind along the grass, may unknowingly correct their path toward misleading sources. For the traveller, whose attention was already divided by the visual repetition around him, the warped soundscape became another quiet force nudging him deeper into disorientation. Clusters of pines and scattered boulders appeared in unexpected alignments, and the gentle slopes of the meadow, though familiar from maps and guides, no longer offered a predictable path. He turned repeatedly, seeking landmarks, but the more he searched, the more the terrain seemed to fold in on itself. A small rise that had appeared distant moments ago now seemed just ahead. A rocky outcrop that should have been behind him appeared to repeat itself. Even the streams, normally reliable guides toward lower terrain, shifted their apparent flow depending on his angle of approach. Each step heightened a growing tension, a subtle fear that the land he trusted was no longer entirely knowable, a forested trickster hiding in plain sight. Time became a slippery thing as he paused repeatedly, trying to reconcile the recurring shapes of rocks and small clearings with the route he thought he knew, yet each glance returned only subtle inconsistencies. His mind, trained for careful observation and route planning, struggled to assign meaning to what he saw. A cluster of shrubs might indicate the approach to a familiar trail junction, only for the next rise to reveal a clearing that looked the same but in a different location. He began to notice the repetition, the same boulders, the same patches of wildflowers, the same angle of sunlight on the slopes. Each mirrored element made it more difficult to trust his senses, and a creeping sense of unreality began to set in. A shallow stream cutting across the meadow became his guide, yet even following its course offered no certainty, as the subtle dips and rises of the terrain seemed to alter direction when he tried to reconcile them with the main trail. He stepped carefully over wet stones, listening to the water gurgle over smooth surfaces, hoping that it would lead him toward a known landmark. But the hills folded in unexpected ways, and bends in the stream appeared repeatedly, as if he were circling through a series of natural echoes. Even when he climbed a small rise to survey the horizon, familiar huts and distant tree lines appeared in misleading positions, sometimes closer than they should be, sometimes farther. Each corrective action brought only momentary reassurance, followed by renewed uncertainty. After what felt like hours of wandering, distant voices and footsteps approached, and local hikers guided him back to a familiar track, confirming that he had drifted far from the markers he trusted. The relief of seeing another human presence brought a momentary clarity, yet the traveller's description of the shifting trail and repeated landmarks was met with polite skepticism. Guides in the region were familiar with the challenges of Uzana meadows. The interplay of low slopes, hidden streams, and tree clusters can confuse even seasoned hikers, but few had heard of a path seeming to move as described. He recounted the experience with precision, speaking of markers that appeared to change orientation, meadows that looped back upon themselves, and streams whose bends felt rearranged. Residents of the nearby village speak of the meadow with quiet respect, recounting how even skilled hikers sometimes sense paths bending unexpectedly, leaving behind an unexplained sense of spatial disorientation. The area has long been used for pastoral activity, with shepherds guiding flocks along summer paths and foragers gathering herbs and mushrooms. Some note that the weather in this high meadow can change with unusual rapidity, that morning sunlight can give way to thick clouds, and that sounds travel differently across the gentle hills, making perception unreliable. Yet even with these explanations, the experience of the lost traveller remained unusual. He had not encountered fog or heavy weather, nor had he strayed far enough from known tracks to make natural error likely. Through Uzana's quiet hills, trails subtly change, challenging those who believe they know exactly where they are headed. The Jelava trail runner. The runner's shoes struck the gravel trail with a steady rhythm, each step echoing through the silent ridge as he pushed along the winding paths that would soon test his sense of direction in unexpected ways. Jelava, nestled within the central Balkan Mountains, is known for its steep undulating ridges and forested slopes, a favourite destination for both recreational hikers and local trail runners seeking technical challenges. The trail he followed had been used for decades by athletes training for endurance events, yet it is precisely the familiarity that can betray even the most disciplined traveller. What began as a routine morning run quickly evolved into an experience that would later be recorded among the strange incidents of the Balkan Mountain Trails. The runner felt the usual thrill of speed and exertion, unaware that within minutes his confidence in the landscape would begin to unravel. Jagged rocks and scattered roots demanded careful footing, forcing him to adjust his stride and balance constantly, while the forest canopy filtered sunlight in shifting patterns across the trail. Pine needles cushioned some steps while other patches of loose soil threatened to send him skidding, and the constant variation of the terrain required a combination of agility and attentiveness. Among the undergrowth, small clearings revealed clusters of wildflowers, including Balkan bellflowers and mountain lilies, their uneven growth subtly shaping the runner's perception of direction. These ridges, while celebrated for their natural beauty, are deceptively irregular, with small dips and rises that can mislead anyone moving at speed. Even the rhythmic sound of his own footfalls occasionally betrayed him, echoing from gullies and ridges in ways that distorted distance and placement. Along the mid-slope section of Jelava, faint temperature gradients forming between shaded hollows and sun-exposed ridges created thin layers of wavering air that subtly distorted depth perception, a phenomenon well documented by mountaineers who traverse these elevations throughout the year. Warm currents rising from patches of bare soil occasionally blurred the outlines of nearby rocks, making them appear to shift or tilt as the runner passed, while cooler pockets of air held shadows in place longer than expected. These delicate variations, almost imperceptible to someone moving at speed, can nudge the eye toward false lines in the terrain and coax the mind into following contours that do not truly align. In that moment, the runner's vision registered shapes and slopes that seemed correct, yet each step carried him slightly off the path he believed he was maintaining. Small animal tracks crisscrossed the trail, including those of foxes, wild boar, and the occasional roe deer, which suggested movement and life just beyond the runner's immediate vision. Zoologists note that Jelava's ridges are frequented by such wildlife, and their sudden appearances or fleeting rustles can momentarily startle even experienced hikers and athletes. In this instance, the faint impressions in the soil, combined with the shadow of moving branches, may have contributed to a subtle distortion of the runner's perception, reinforcing the feeling that the trail was less predictable than it should have been. Landmarks he had memorized for training runs appeared displaced, trees and boulders recurring in sequences that left him questioning whether he'd passed them before or was simply imagining repetition. A moss-covered boulder that should have appeared only once seemed to repeat on a nearby rise, and the angles of fallen trees created visual echoes that confused judgment. The runner slowed momentarily, attempting to recalibrate, but each glance across the ridge suggested that the familiar terrain was subtly, inexplicably shifting. He could feel the rise and fall of the hills underfoot, yet the horizon offered little guidance. Distant peaks seemed to rearrange themselves with every stride. The sensation was faint at first, almost negligible, but it grew insistent, a quiet warning that the trail's straightforward logic might no longer apply. Crossing a narrow ravine carved by seasonal water flows, he lost sight of the main track entirely, and the trail's contours seemed to bend unpredictably under his hurried pace. Rocks polished smooth by winter runoff created treacherous footing, and small ledges forced him to leap or carefully navigate along precarious edges. In a matter of minutes, the familiar path behind him vanished into thick brush, leaving only the sound of running water and the occasional rustle of leaves. At this moment, his sense of linear direction faltered. Steps that should have led him forward instead carried him into loops and folds within the terrain. Though he tried to trust memory and instinct, the natural features of Jelava seemed to obscure rather than guide. Search dogs later traced an erratic path through gullies and clearings, confirming that his route had defied simple logic and that each step taken off the marked trail created a non-linear trail difficult to follow. Handlers described a scent pattern that doubled back unexpectedly, weaving through minor ravines and then re-emerging near familiar sections of the ridge. These animals, trained to detect the faintest trail, indicated that the runner had not merely strayed, but moved in a manner that confounded both perception and predictability. In recounting the event, the athlete described flashes of recognition, trees, rocks, and small clearings appearing briefly familiar before slipping into misalignment, creating a sense of being pursued by a landscape that refused to stay constant. Branches, loose stones, and uneven ground required rapid decisions with every stride, the sharp inhale of exertion and pounding heartbeat intensifying his sense of urgency and awareness. At points, he had to vault over fallen trunks or sidestep boulders jutting into the trail, all while maintaining enough speed to avoid fatigue and maintain balance. The combination of physical exertion and perceptual confusion magnified every small obstacle, turning routine movements into moments of critical focus. Even sunlight and shadow seemed to shift unpredictably as he moved, further altering his judgment of slope and distance. Each step reinforced a growing tension. Though he could see the trail, it did not behave as expected, and each stride carried him deeper into uncertainty. Distant voices eventually reached him across the ridge, and the sight of rescuers brought both relief and the unsettling realization that the trail he thought he knew had shifted in ways he could not explain. Volunteers from a local mountain rescue team guided him back to the marked path, confirming that his detour had carried him over a series of minor ridges and gullies that, from above, appeared deceptively straightforward. The runner recounted with precision the points where markers seemed to move, clearings repeated themselves, and streams curved back upon themselves. Though physically unharmed, the mental disorientation left a lingering sense of wonder and unease, highlighting how the mind can misinterpret familiar terrain under speed, fatigue, and the natural irregularities of the landscape. Local trail runners remark on Jelava's deceptive ridges, where slight changes in slope and dense clusters of trees can create illusions that subtly redirect motion and challenge perception. The region has long been used for training and recreational running, with technical ridges and narrow trails attracting athletes seeking endurance challenges. In interviews, experienced runners admit that even brief lapses in concentration or minor deviations from the marked trail can result in unusual perceptual experiences, though few encounter the degree of disorientation reported in this incident. Observers note that light filtering through dense forest patches, combined with repetitive topographical features, can amplify the sensation of a moving or repeating trail. These factors, while explainable, do not entirely account for the athlete's sense that the terrain momentarily defied expectation. The twisting ridges of Jelava conceal trails that challenge even the swiftest travellers, leaving subtle traces hinting at something inexplicable. The mist vanishings of Troan Pass. Sharp cliffs and narrow ledges of Troan Pass stretch into the distance, where travellers have long vanished under conditions that even seasoned hikers cannot fully explain. The pass, situated in the central Balkan Mountains, rises to elevations between 900 and 1,200 metres, with ridges that twist sharply and gullies carved by centuries of runoff. Local hikers and guides speak of incidents in which travellers disappeared without a trace when fog rolled in suddenly, leaving only echoes of their presence. While the pass is frequently used for hiking and mountaineering, these stories persist, blending natural hazards with unexplained disappearances. Those who have traversed the trails in late autumn or early spring note an eerie quiet that descends, broken only by the occasional distant call of a bird or the whisper of wind along the cliffs. The limestone terrain absorbs sound differently depending on moisture levels, creating a muffled stillness that seems almost unnatural when the fog thickens. Sudden drops and hidden gullies break up the limestone ridges, and narrow trails along the ledges offer little space for error, forming corridors that challenge one's sense of direction. Surveyors note that some sections narrow to barely a metre, while gullies drop abruptly for several metres, forcing careful navigation. Heavy rainfall and melting snow further erode paths each year, creating pockets of loose gravel and slick limestone slabs that can give way underfoot. Clumps of moss and shrubs cling to cracks, softening some surfaces but hiding uneven ground beneath. In certain stretches, even experienced hikers must stop to reassess footing, negotiating rock formations that appear static but shift subtly under repeated contact. The complexity of the terrain makes misjudgment easy, and many minor accidents, scrapes, sprains and falls have been documented along these slopes. As the temperature dropped one autumn morning, clouds of damp air thickened along the pass, reducing visibility to only a few metres and causing familiar landmarks to dissolve into grey haze. Trail markers, painted on stones or wooden posts, blurred into the mist, leaving travellers with only instinct to guide them. The traveller felt the cold, damp air pressing against skin and lungs, while the limestone exhaled a faint mineral scent that mixed with the musty smell of wet foliage. Streams running through gullies gurgled softly but inconsistently as sound warped in the dense air. Even the rhythm of footsteps seemed altered, echoing unpredictably off cliff faces and creating a sense that the trail bent and twisted unnaturally. Mental tension increased as the mind attempted to reconcile these sensory distortions, heightening anxiety with each hesitant step. On the upper curves of the pass, temperature inversions can form pockets of chilled air between the ridges, casting faint rings of refracted light around stones, branches, and the traveller's own outline. These fleeting coronas, observed by mountaineers during sudden fog events, can appear and vanish within seconds, subtly altering the apparent position of objects along the trail. In these moments, the boundary between foreground and background seems to shift, turning stable features into wavering shapes that pull the eye toward false contours. For anyone moving cautiously along a narrow ledge, these distortions introduce hesitation and doubt, each step guided as much by instinct as by the unreliable cues drifting through the mist. Every sound seemed warped in the dense atmosphere, echoes bouncing unpredictably off cliff faces, while shadows and rocks appeared to shift in ways that distorted depth and orientation. Small animal tracks, fox, wild boar, and the occasional roe deer crisscrossed the path, their subtle impressions sometimes misread as human or something else entirely. The sharp angles of cliffs multiplied in perception, and boulders emerged where none had been expected. Researchers note that optical illusions are common in fog-laden limestone ridges, but these natural effects cannot fully explain the sense of paths folding upon themselves or disappearing entirely. The traveller occasionally glimpsed vague shapes at the edge of vision, fleeting and intangible, leaving the mind to question whether the encounter was real or a trick of perception intensified by stress and limited visibility. At one precarious curve, the trail appeared to vanish beneath the traveller's feet, leaving only the impression of sheer cliffs and a void that could swallow the unwary. Physiologically, the sudden disorientation triggered a rapid heartbeat and shallow breathing, a fight or flight response to perceived danger. Vertigo set in as the brain struggled to reconcile conflicting visual cues, and each step forward required extreme caution. The rocky surface, interspersed with loose stones, moss, and shallow gullies, tested balance and attention. Only after several tense moments did the trail reappear, yet the psychological impact lingered, leaving the traveller acutely aware of how fragile the sense of orientation can become under these conditions. Mountain guides recall the careful techniques used to recover lost hikers, from systematically following subtle trail contours to signalling across ridges when the fog lifts. High visibility markers and reflective posts, supplemented by whistles or shouted names, are deployed along the most hazardous sections. Dogs trained for search and rescue also participate, their tracking sometimes revealing zigzagging paths or movements that appear to defy linear logic. Documented rescues note that hikers can sometimes end up hundreds of meters from the point at which they were last seen, underscoring how easily disorientation in fog can alter perceived distance and trajectory. Even those familiar with the pass are advised to remain vigilant, recognizing that sudden weather changes can make retracing steps perilous or impossible without assistance. Climatologists note that sudden shifts in wind, humidity and temperature can create localized clouds along the pass, producing dense pockets of fog that persist even while surrounding ridges remain clear. These microclimates contribute to optical illusions that distort slope and distance, making familiar terrain seem unfamiliar. The interaction of sunlight, shadow, and reflective limestone surfaces can further confuse perception, creating the sensation of disappearing paths or misaligned ledges. Hikers and researchers alike report a subtle but persistent sensation of being watched or guided during these conditions, although no verifiable presence has ever been recorded. The combination of environmental factors and human perceptual limits creates situations that, while explainable scientifically, retain a strong air of mystery. Stories have long circulated among local villages of travellers vanishing into Troan's mists, mixing practical warnings with fleeting figures and whispered voices along the cliffs. In some tales, hikers are briefly seen emerging from fog hours later, claiming to have been pulled along unseen routes or guided by imperceptible forces. Others are never recovered, leaving only anecdotal memory to mark their absence. These stories, repeated across generations, emphasize both the danger of the terrain and the enduring mystique of the pass. While folklore often frames these vanishings in supernatural terms, the practical hazard of sudden fog, cliffside drops and deceptive paths provides a real and present explanation for many incidents. Even the flora contributes to the deceptive nature of the pass. Mosses and ferns grow densely in shadowed gullies, creating soft patches that mask uneven terrain, while clusters of mountain shrubs form natural barriers along ledges that appear continuous but conceal drops. In wet conditions, leaves and small stones become slippery, requiring constant attention. Birds and small mammals, moving quickly through the fog, occasionally cross the trail, momentarily startling hikers and amplifying the sense of instability. All of these factors converge to produce conditions where a single misstep, a momentary lapse in concentration, or a brief illusion can have serious consequences. After the fog clears, the cliffs of Troan Pass retain a silent vigilance, as though the next traveller's steps might disappear before anyone notices. The Whispering Gullies of Cherepish. The gullies near Cherepish have long carried a reputation among hikers for subtle disappearances, and travellers speak of sounds that seem almost alive, weaving through narrow ravines with an uncanny clarity. Unlike the broader mountain ridges, these gullies are compressed channels carved from limestone over millennia, where walls rise sharply on either side and paths twist unpredictably. Locals describe the area as one where a traveller's senses can be tricked by the terrain itself, and incidents, though few in official records, have cemented the gully's mystique. Even those familiar with the area approach with caution, aware that the echoes of wind or water can obscure distance, direction, and the presence of others. As one hiker recounted, moving silently through the gullies, a rustle of leaves sounded directly behind, only to vanish when glanced at, leaving the sense of being both observed and isolated. Jagged limestone walls rise sharply on either side, while narrow trails wind along ledges barely wide enough for a single foot, their edges softened by moss and low shrubs that mask uneven rock beneath. The gullies are a series of short corridors interspersed with wider pockets, each segment creating distinct microclimates. Sunlight filters sporadically through trees above, illuminating patches of moss and fern while leaving shadows that conceal dips and fissures. Rainwater often collects in shallow depressions, turning stones slick and unpredictable. For travellers, the terrain demands constant vigilance, as a momentary lapse can result in slipping or misjudging depth along edges that plummet several meters. These environmental features make each footstep a test of attention and balance, heightening tension even before any mysterious phenomena emerge. Patches of dense ferns and scattered oak saplings break up the path, while occasional loose stones and eroded gullies add an unpredictable rhythm to each step along the cliffs. Small shrubs and undergrowth provide cover for wildlife, yet they also obscure the trail in subtle ways, contributing to minor disorientation. Seasonal rainfall can wash away soil around tree roots or destabilize rocks along narrow edges, making the gullies even more treacherous. Hikers familiar with the region often advise following a slow, deliberate pace, maintaining focus not just on the immediate trail but also on the subtle signs that indicate where footing is secure. Despite these precautions, even experienced individuals report a sense of unease, as if the gullies themselves are shifting imperceptibly underfoot. Whispers, generated by wind channeled through narrow channels or by the rustle of leaves, carry unnervingly, making it difficult to discern whether sounds originate from the terrain itself or from fellow travellers. The gully's natural acoustics amplify and distort even minor noises, creating the impression of movement in spaces that are empty. Water trickling through cracks produces echoes that seem to come from unexpected directions, while the vibration of stones underfoot can resonate unnaturally along limestone walls. Travellers often describe these sounds as voices or faint footsteps, though no one else is present, adding a psychological layer to the physical challenges of the path. This auditory complexity turns the simple act of walking into a subtle negotiation between perception and reality. The interplay of echoes and natural acoustics can produce a sensation of movement at the periphery of vision, heightening tension and producing a subtle sense of vertigo or unease. Hikers sometimes pause, unsure whether a shadow flickering across moss or a leaf tumbling along a ledge is evidence of other people, wildlife, or merely the shifting light. The human brain instinctively seeks patterns and sources in ambiguous environments, and the gullies exploit this tendency. Multiple accounts describe travellers briefly losing their sense of direction, convinced they had passed the same feature twice, or perceiving ledges and pathways that appeared only fleetingly before dissolving into shadow. Even when conscious of these illusions, the body reacts with adrenaline and heightened alertness, further amplifying the sense of strangeness. Hikers report moments of disorientation when navigating these gullies, occasionally stepping off trail or misjudging the depth of hidden depressions, sometimes requiring rescue teams familiar with the area. While no comprehensive registry exists for such incidents, anecdotal accounts suggest that many minor disappearances are resolved within hours when searchers follow the gullies' winding paths carefully. In several documented cases, travellers emerged disoriented but physically unharmed, recounting experiences of moving through areas where walls seemed closer or farther than they actually were. These narratives, while unusual, illustrate how the gully's unique combination of topography and acoustics can create a temporary but profound disruption of perception. Search and rescue efforts employ systematic calls, reflective markers, and tracking dogs to locate missing travellers. Yet even these methods are complicated by the gully's natural acoustics and concealed terrain. Reflective markers placed along the trail can be obscured by undergrowth, while echoes make directional calls difficult to interpret. Tracking dogs must navigate narrow channels, often contorting to follow scents that twist unpredictably along rock walls. Rescue teams familiar with the gullies emphasize careful observation, attention to wind patterns, and awareness of the gully's propensity for producing deceptive sounds. In many cases, the combination of technique and patience allows lost travellers to be found, though the experience leaves both rescuer and hiker with a lingering impression of the gully's unusual character. Locals tell of wanderers vanishing briefly, reappearing with only vague recollections of how they crossed sections that seemed to shift or whisper to them, blending documented incidents with folkloric tradition. Some speak of fleeting figures or shapes that appear along ledges, vanishing as observers approach, while others describe the sensation of being gently guided or nudged along paths that seem to shift beneath them. Generations of shepherds, hunters and hikers have passed down these stories, embedding cautionary lessons in tales of the gully's unpredictable nature. While the accounts vary, they consistently emphasize an environment where perception is tested and even familiar terrain can produce uncertainty. Even those who emerge unscathed describe a lingering impression that the gullies themselves possess awareness, an almost sentient quality that bends perception and time across their narrow channels. Travellers often report a dual sense of safety and threat, as if the gullies simultaneously conceal and reveal. The shifting interplay of shadows, sound and stone creates moments where it is difficult to distinguish between actual danger and the mind's interpretation of signals. Some hikers claim that time seems distorted in these areas, with minutes stretching or contracting unpredictably, while scientific explanations, acoustic resonance, light refraction, uneven footing, account for much of the experience. They fail to capture the profound, almost psychological sense of mystery that persists long after leaving the gullies. Moss, ferns, and small shrubs continue to shape the paths, altering footing and perception with each step. During wet or windy periods, the gullies amplify these effects, producing subtle sounds, shifting reflections, and unexpected textures beneath boots. Birds or small mammals crossing unexpectedly can be perceived as larger or nearer than reality, adding to the sense of disorientation. These environmental and sensory factors combine to form conditions where travellers may briefly lose their bearings, sometimes emerging hours later with only fragmented memories of their passage. Despite the challenges, hikers drawn to Cherepish often return, seeking to navigate the gullies successfully and experience the quiet allure of a place where nature itself seems to communicate in whispers. And as twilight falls over the cliffs of Cherepish, the gullies hold their whispers in silence, waiting for the next traveller to hear them and step unknowingly into their enigmatic depths. The two shadows of Studenitz Ridge. Dusk settles over Studenitz Ridge, where hikers have reported the unsettling presence of twin silhouettes that seem to mirror their movements along the fading light. The ridge, stretching across the northern Balkan Mountains, offers sweeping views of pine and beech forests, yet the upper reaches are defined by jagged limestone outcrops and abrupt drops that amplify both awe and trepidation. Travellers recount a strange sense of familiarity and difference at once, as if the terrain itself is aware of their presence. Several documented accounts note that hikers passing the ridge at twilight have glimpsed figures that remain at the periphery of vision, disappearing only when directly observed. The phenomenon, while anecdotal, is consistent enough to draw curiosity from local guides and researchers studying human perception under natural stressors. Pine and beech trees thin along the upper slopes, revealing rugged ledges where the trail becomes narrow and uneven. The ground is often littered with loose gravel and fractured limestone, forming a natural mosaic of obstacles that demands steady footing. Wind gusts sweep across the ridge with variable intensity, carrying the scent of moss, earth, and distant conifers, and creating subtle shifts in light and shadow. Hikers navigating these trails report that even minor miscalculations in pace or balance are immediately evident, leaving a fleeting sense of exposure above the steep valleys below. These physical challenges are compounded by the visual anomalies that emerge in fading daylight, blending tangible danger with the uncanny. Loose gravel and uneven stone paths wind along the ridge, narrowing at certain points where a misstep could send a traveller sliding toward precipitous drops. Some sections require careful negotiation of jagged rocks and overhanging ledges, particularly where the limestone has eroded into sharp ridges. Seasonal rainfall adds another layer of complexity, leaving surfaces slick and obscuring hidden depressions. Hikers describe moments where the path seems both familiar and alien, with familiar stones appearing displaced or shadows lengthened unnaturally, a subtle distortion of perception that precedes the encounters with the so-called twin shadows. As the sun dips below the horizon, elongated shadows stretch across ledges and gullies, often creating shapes that appear humanoid or animate from a distance. Light filtering through sparse trees can generate patterns that mimic movement, giving the impression that figures pace alongside or behind the observer. Several hikers note that the shadows are almost synchronized with their own actions, tilting, stretching, or shifting as they do, creating a fleeting sensation of companionship or pursuit. This optical complexity transforms ordinary twilight into an environment rife with tension and uncertainty, where the eye struggles to differentiate between rock, foliage, and perceived motion. The interplay of fading light, irregular surfaces, and the human eye's tendency to pattern match can transform ordinary boulders or shrubs into twin figures tracking the observer. Perception in low-light conditions is inherently unreliable, and the ridge accentuates this unreliability. Subtle movements of leaves, the sway of saplings, and the angle of incoming light combine to produce illusions that are almost impossible to consciously ignore. Hikers recount a sense of being observed from multiple angles simultaneously, a disconcerting awareness that persists even after they leave the ridge, suggesting that the experience lingers in memory as much as in physical space. Several hikers describe a momentary feeling of being followed, a reflexive glance revealing shadows that mimic posture and pace with unnerving precision. These encounters are typically brief, lasting only seconds, yet they leave a strong impression on those who witness them. Some travellers attempt to challenge the shadows by changing direction or slowing pace, only to perceive the figures responding in kind, vanishing just as direct observation occurs. The combination of anticipation, visual distortion, and environmental complexity produces a subtle but pervasive anxiety, a shared sensation reported by multiple hikers over years of anecdotal documentation. Rapid heartbeat, tightened muscles, and shallow breathing often accompany the perception of the shadows as the mind oscillates between rational understanding and instinctive fear. Even experienced hikers who understand the optical and environmental causes admit to a physical reaction indistinguishable from genuine alarm. The body responds to uncertainty and perceived threat in ways that are immediate and involuntary, reinforcing the sense that the ridge is alive in some hidden perceptual dimension. Moments of hesitation or abrupt stopping are common, and many hikers find themselves scanning both ground and horizon repeatedly, trying to reconcile what they see with what they know. Local guides occasionally accompany those navigating the ridge at dusk, noting that hikers sometimes retreat after glimpsing ambiguous figures, only to find no one else present upon investigation. Guides emphasize the importance of maintaining a calm pace, focusing on landmarks, and using group coordination to counteract optical illusions. Reports collected by rescue organizations suggest that most hikers experience only brief periods of disorientation, yet the intensity of the perceived phenomenon leaves a lasting psychological imprint. Guides often recount tales of travelers returning days later to describe similar experiences, further cementing the ridge's reputation as a site where light, terrain, and perception intersect mysteriously. Steep declines, narrow ledges, and sudden elevation changes combine with low light to increase the likelihood of misperception, explaining many instances of hikers' disorientation. A subtle drop in the ridge's gradient can appear more severe in fading light, while distant trees cast shadows that create false depth cues. Hikers navigating alone are particularly vulnerable, as the absence of another person to anchor perception amplifies the sense of unease. These factors, though fully explainable by terrain and light conditions, intersect with folklore and anecdotal observation to produce a compelling narrative of twin figures that cannot be fully dismissed by science alone. Stories passed down through generations describe twin spirits or guardians of the ridge, appearing at twilight to those venturing alone or unprepared. Shepherds, hunters, and local villagers recount tales of figures that emerge silently from the shadows, mirroring movement and disappearing without a trace. Some suggest these shadows serve as warnings, guiding or testing travelers in unfamiliar terrain, while others attribute them to restless spirits tied to historic events along the ridge. Even though no verifiable encounters confirm supernatural activity, the consistency of the stories adds a layer of cultural weight that intertwines with the ridge's physical and optical challenges. While some hikers dismiss the tales as superstition, researchers note that physiological and optical effects at dusk, combined with uneven terrain, produce compelling illusions of figures that seem real. The human brain, tuned to recognize patterns and animate forms, amplifies the perception of twin silhouettes when contextual cues, such as light, shadow, and environmental noise, are ambiguous. Scientific observation confirms that such effects are common in areas with steep relief and variable lighting, yet the precise timing, location, and duration of encounters continue to puzzle even experienced observers. The ridge becomes a nexus of natural and psychological factors, blurring the boundary between what is seen and what is inferred. Even those who continue along the ridge without incident report a lingering impression of its peculiar character, an intangible sense that the terrain itself can manipulate sight and expectation. Hikers often recall the way shadows stretch and retract in ways that defy immediate explanation, leaving behind a tension that is physical, cognitive, and emotional at once. For some, the experience evokes awe. For others, it instills a caution that endures long after descent. In both cases, the ridge holds its secrets tightly, rewarding careful observation while resisting definitive understanding. When shadows lengthen over Student's Ridge, it becomes impossible to know whether what moves beside you is human, spectral, or simply the ridge itself playing tricks on the fading light. The trail that moves near Veshen. A narrow forest path near Veshen has baffled hikers for decades, with repeated reports describing a trail that seems to shift subtly beneath their feet. Travellers recount the unnerving sensation of passing landmarks that should be familiar, only to find them displaced or oddly altered when looked at again. The Vesn region, part of the central Balkan Mountains, rises to nearly 2,200 metres at its peak, with dense spruce and fir forest dominating its slopes. Hikers have long reported that as they follow the trail, a subtle disorientation sets in, leaving them uncertain whether they are progressing along the intended path or retracing steps unnoticed. Local guides describe it as a place where the forest itself seems to challenge memory, perception and direction. Spruce and fir trees grow densely along the slopes, their branches forming an interwoven canopy that filters sunlight into dappled, ever-changing patterns on the ground. The understory is a mixture of moss, ferns, and scattered beech saplings, creating a rich but uneven walking surface. In some areas, fallen logs and thick root networks obscure sections of the trail, forcing hikers to step carefully and constantly reassess their footing. These natural obstacles, while common in mountainous terrain, interact with the peculiar perceptions reported on the trail, amplifying uncertainty in a way that transforms a familiar path into an enigmatic labyrinth. The incline alternates between gentle ascents and steep pitches, with patches of moss-covered stone and loose gravel complicating navigation for those unfamiliar with the forest floor. Moisture from morning dew or recent rainfall often renders stones slippery, and the soil in depressions can obscure subtle changes in gradient. Travellers report that areas of the trail once easily traversed suddenly feel longer, as though distance itself has expanded. The cumulative effect of uneven terrain and shifting light conditions produces a sense of temporal and spatial distortion, heightening the impression that the forest subtly rearranges itself with every step. Light angles, leaf shadows, and the natural curvature of the terrain conspire to create optical illusions, making familiar sections of the path appear displaced or unfamiliar. Afternoon sun filters through gaps in the canopy, casting long angled shadows that intersect and overlap in ways that confuse depth perception. Small depressions and knolls can appear as tunnels or hidden turns when viewed from certain angles, and rocks jutting from the ground seem to shift position as the observer moves. Hikers often report a fleeting sense of movement within these illusions, as though the forest is actively shifting around them, even in the absence of wind or other disturbances. Hikers often pause, convinced they have circled back to the same clearing, only to find the surroundings subtly altered, as though the trail itself has shifted overnight. Markers that appeared obvious minutes earlier seem misplaced or absent, and trees previously seen from a particular vantage appear in slightly different positions. Even the most experienced hikers are susceptible to this subtle distortion, which combines environmental complexity with the human brain's natural tendency to seek patterns and familiar shapes. Several documented accounts describe travellers retracing their steps multiple times before realising the trail had not returned to its original position, but had instead offered a slightly altered course. Several accounts describe moments when landmarks vanished from sight or seemed to migrate along the trail, prompting a disorienting loop of perception that challenges memory and confidence. Stones, tree trunks, and mossy depressions sometimes appear to move when revisited after short intervals, leading hikers to question their recollection of the path. One report details a hiker following a small ridge, noting a particular fallen branch as a reference point, only to find the branch replaced by an unfamiliar stone pile moments later. While natural explanations for these occurrences exist, the consistency of such reports has contributed to the local reputation of the trail as mysteriously mutable. Unease mounts as the forest grows quieter and wind patterns shift unpredictably, and travellers report tension, fatigue, and a heightened awareness of their surroundings. The dense canopy dampens distant sounds, while sudden gusts of wind rustle needles and leaves, producing shadows and flickers that exaggerate movement along the trail. Hikers often experience a creeping sense of isolation, even when groups travel together, as spatial cues fail and the forest's repetitive textures confuse both eye and mind. The combination of physical exertion, limited visibility, and subtle environmental manipulation creates a psychological effect that can last well beyond the time spent on the path. Local guides note that even experienced hikers occasionally misjudge distances or trail markers, requiring careful retracing and multiple checks to ensure progress along the intended route. Guides emphasize maintaining a slow, deliberate pace, relying on tactile cues such as route networks and stone patterns, and using GPS or maps to confirm orientation. Despite these precautions, reports persist of travellers feeling the trail shift beneath them, with landmarks appearing to move or disappear. These occurrences are typically brief but unnerving, leaving a lasting impression of uncertainty that hikers carry long after leaving the forest. Steep banks, hidden depressions, and subtle changes in soil texture can mislead those relying on sight alone, while fog or overcast light intensifies the illusion of movement along the path. Morning mist clinging to the canopy amplifies these effects, casting shadows in unpredictable ways and reducing the reliability of visual cues. Hikers report that areas easily navigated in clear weather transform into deceptive, maze-like stretches under these conditions. The interplay between terrain, light, and atmospheric factors creates a persistent ambiguity, challenging the perception of a fixed, reliable trail. Stories passed through generations describe travellers who disappeared along the trail only to reappear hours later with no memory of the intervening route, reinforcing the law of a forest that rearranges itself. Shepherds and villagers recount tales of wanderers stepping off the path only to find themselves confronted by a section of trail they could not have reached by any logical means. These accounts, while anecdotal, are reinforced by consistent details. Hikers become disoriented, landmarks seem to move, and subtle environmental cues combine to create the impression of a living, shifting path. For locals, the trail near Vejen has become emblematic of the unpredictable and enigmatic character of the Balkan forests. While researchers attribute these experiences to spatial disorientation, topographical complexity, and visual illusion, local tradition frames the trail as a living entity, testing or guiding those who traverse it. The forest's density, uneven terrain, and variable lighting conditions can reliably produce illusions of movement and altered direction. Yet the persistence of accounts spanning decades gives the trail an aura beyond simple explanation. Hikers emerge from the path with the same reports: loops that feel endless, landmarks that vanish and reappear, and the sensation that the trail itself is subtly reshaping around them. Even those who traverse the path without incident often recall the trail's peculiar character, an intangible sense that the forest itself participates in the journey. Hikers describe moments where perception flickers between certainty and doubt, as if the environment itself is aware of their presence. The experience leaves a lingering tension that is cognitive, physical, and emotional, compelling even experienced travellers to reflect on the forest's hidden dynamics long after the walk has ended. In this way, the trail serves as both a physical challenge and a psychological puzzle, its mysteries embedded in the shifting interplay of terrain, light, and human perception. And when the forest shifts beneath your feet on the Vejen Trail, even the most familiar path can vanish entirely, leaving only uncertainty in its wake. The Vanishing Shepherd of Kalifa High Pastures. High above Kalifa, in the expansive mountain pastures, a shepherd vanished under circumstances that continue to puzzle locals and hikers alike. The incident, recounted in hushed tones throughout the surrounding villages, describes a man familiar with every ridge and grazing slope, suddenly swallowed by the high-altitude landscape he had tended for decades. The Kalifa High Pastures lie in the central Balkan Mountains, with elevations ranging from roughly 1,400 to 1,600 metres, their undulating terrain offering both lush grazing and hidden dangers. Hikers and shepherds alike have long noted that weather can shift abruptly, visibility can drop without warning, and familiar ground can transform into a disorienting expanse where direction and distance lose meaning. The pastures stretch across gentle slopes and rugged ridges, interspersed with rocky outcrops and scattered clusters of pines that punctuate the open grasslands. Meadows of tall grasses sway in gusting wind, occasionally concealing small depressions or stones that can unseat an unwary step. The scattered pines provide shade and shelter, yet their shadows contribute to a shifting landscape where perception of distance and scale can falter. Herding paths crisscross the pastures, worn from years of animal passage, yet these faint trails vanish under fog or snow, leaving even familiar sections eerily unrecognisable to the human eye. At elevations approaching 1,600 metres, the air thins and temperatures fluctuate dramatically, creating a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving for those who work its heights. Morning frosts can linger in depressions, turning soil slippery and treacherous. while midday sun warms exposed rock and grass, producing thermal shifts that alter footing and perception. Even small elevation changes can mask the contours of the land, making gentle slopes feel abrupt or concealing sudden drop-offs. For a shepherd accustomed to traversing these pastures daily, the terrain demands vigilance and respect, a combination of skill, endurance, and constant awareness. Sudden fogs can descend without warning, concealing landmarks and turning familiar trails into featureless expanses where even seasoned guides hesitate. Thick mist curls through valleys and clings to ridgelines, blurring the horizon and muffling distant sounds. A ridge visible moments ago can vanish entirely, and distant trees become amorphous shapes in the grey. Shepherds and hikers report that the fog alters not only what they can see, but how they feel, creating a sense of dislocation and temporal distortion, as though hours pass without any measurable progress along the ground. Gusts of wind whip across the open meadows, carrying the scents of pine and damp earth while distorting sounds, making distant movements nearly impossible to judge accurately. The rush of air can mask the bleating of sheep or the call of a fellow traveller, intensifying the feeling of isolation. Wind patterns across the slopes are unpredictable, bouncing off ridges and cliffs to create sudden bursts or lulls. These shifts complicate both navigation and communication, leaving travellers vulnerable to the elements and prone to misjudgment in a landscape where mistakes carry consequences. Each day the shepherd moves among flocks of sheep and goats, tending to grazing patterns and guiding animals toward higher grass, a solitary figure navigating terrain that is as unforgiving as it is open. He knows where to find water, how to avoid hidden rock formations, and which sections of meadow yield the richest pastures. Yet, even with intimate familiarity, the environment retains a capacity for surprise. A fog bank or a sudden gust can turn a routine afternoon into a test of perception and endurance, highlighting the precarious balance between skill and vulnerability in these high-altitude meadows. The most skilled can be deceived when fog gathers or shadows shift, leaving a sense of disorientation despite familiar landmarks. Small depressions in the terrain, slight inclines, and overlapping vegetation can confound visual memory, creating loops or dead ends that were invisible moments earlier. Travellers often report a strange sensation of wandering without progress, of seeing familiar ground rearranged as though the mountain itself has altered overnight. This subtle manipulation of perception may explain and in part why the shepherd disappeared in a landscape he had traversed countless times. Witnesses reported last seeing the shepherd tending sheep near a small ridge, only to discover hours later that both he and his flock had vanished from view, with tracks abruptly ending at a moss-covered rock. Those who found the scene noted that no signs of struggle were evident, and the animals appeared calm, grazing or standing quietly, as if awaiting direction that would never come. Search parties retraced possible routes across the ridges and valleys, yet found nothing further than shallow hoofprints fading into patches of fog-laden grass. The abruptness of the disappearance lent the event an air of enigma, contrasting sharply with the shepherd's methodical and predictable routines. Search parties combed the area, navigating narrow passes, hidden depressions and treacherous cliffs, yet found no trace beyond faint hoofprints leading into fog-draped slopes. Teams of volunteers, sometimes including villagers familiar with every inch of the pastures, struggled against worsening visibility and shifting weather, making systematic searches difficult and exhausting. Even when trails could be followed for hundreds of meters, they often ended inconclusively with the final steps swallowed by vegetation or mist. The absence of a clear explanation compounded the sense of mystery, reinforcing the notion that the mountain held secrets beyond human understanding. Villagers speak of the high pastures as a place where the mountains test those who traverse them, recounting stories of travellers and herders who have disappeared into sudden cloud or storm without explanation. Tales persist of men and women who were skilled, knowledgeable and careful, yet vanished as if claimed by the terrain itself. Local folklore often attributes these disappearances to spirits or guardians of the highlands, framing the mountains as a living presence that rewards caution and punishes hubris. While supernatural explanations exist, even factual accounts consistently note the combination of altitude, sudden weather changes, and sparse landmarks as contributing to disappearances. While meteorological and topographical factors can account for disorientation, the repeated nature of these vanishings adds a layer of cultural weight, framing the pastures as a realm where the line between natural hazard and mystery blurs. Scholars studying the area emphasize that even minor changes in fog density, temperature, or sunlight can dramatically alter visual perception, especially across vast open meadows. Yet, the folklore endures because the phenomenon is recurring and inexplicable within the normal parameters of experience, reinforcing the sense that these high pastures are exceptional, both geographically and psychologically. Even those who traverse the pastures without incident often recall the landscape's peculiar character, an intangible sense of awareness that the mountains impose upon travellers. The feeling lingers as a subtle disquiet, a recognition that the pastures are unpredictable and that disappearance, though uncommon, is always possible. Shepherds speak of a heightened attention during fog or storm, a watchfulness that is part instinct and part learned knowledge, guiding them through conditions where human senses alone may fail. The interplay of environmental risk, isolation, and persistent folklore creates a setting where mystery and reality coexist in delicate tension. The Califa high pastures vanish beneath thick fog, making it impossible to know whether the shepherd is simply wandering, has disappeared, or has been taken by the mountain. The old road of Tvarditsa that leads nowhere. The old road leading from Tvarditsa has long been whispered about for its inexplicable qualities, a path that seems to vanish before reaching any discernible end. Travellers speak cautiously of its stretches, noting how the familiar can suddenly feel unfamiliar, as if the road itself is playing a subtle game of concealment. Local guides recount incidents in which hikers or villagers set out with precise directions, only to return hours later with fragmented recollections and uncertain measurements of distance. The Tvarditsa road, once a minor artery connecting outlying villages to markets and pasture lands, is now abandoned, its reputation entwined with disappearances that continue to spark curiosity and unease. Cobblestones worn smooth by decades of rain and frost stretch through dense forest and open clearings, yet in several sections the pavement has crumbled entirely, leaving only uneven earth beneath the feet of travellers. Moss and lichen cling to the stones, softening their once precise edges, and in places, large slabs have tilted or sunken, creating irregular surfaces that challenge even careful footing. Occasional breaks in the canopy above illuminate stretches of the road in shifting patterns, revealing the gentle undulations of terrain that were once nearly imperceptible to passing traders and shepherds. On either side of the road, overgrown shrubs and encroaching trees obscure the boundaries, and in places, the earth rises or falls imperceptibly, confusing any sense of distance or direction. Fallen branches form natural barricades, and patches of wild grass spring through cracks in the cobblestones, making clear paths difficult to discern. The forest slowly reclaims the road, rendering sections narrow and winding, with only the faintest traces of former maintenance. For anyone navigating it alone, the feeling of being enclosed in a living corridor of shifting greenery can be unsettling, particularly when landmarks that appear familiar suddenly vanish from view. Sunlight filtering through branches creates shifting patterns on the path, altering depth perception and masking subtle bends, while shadows seem to stretch and contract in ways that defy ordinary experience. Midday light can transform small depressions into apparent hollows, and gentle rises may appear far steeper than they are. Travellers note that repeated steps over the same stretch can feel incongruous, as though the ground subtly rearranges itself between passes. This phenomenon, though explainable through angle, light and perspective, contributes to the disquieting sensation that the road refuses to be fully comprehended. When fog settles in low hollows, travellers report that familiar markers appear to shift, intersections lose clarity, and even large boulders seem displaced from memory, leaving the road strangely unrecognisable. Thick mist can obscure even nearby trees, and the outline of the path itself becomes a faint suggestion rather than a solid guide. The quiet that accompanies fog intensifies awareness of each sound, each movement, and each misstep, creating a heightened sense of vulnerability. Those who have walked the road under such conditions often describe a creeping disbelief, where minutes feel like hours and familiar terrain begins to feel foreign. Hikers who have ventured along the route speak of moments when the road appears to loop back upon itself, or when turns that should lead outward instead deposit them near the same tree or rock as minutes before. In some cases, a fork in the path seems straightforward, yet following one branch results in returning to an identical point, as if the road itself has reordered. Travellers frequently check maps or GPS, only to find minor discrepancies that seem inconsequential yet intensify the sensation of dislocation. These experiences, while subject to natural explanations such as perspective errors and uniform terrain, remain psychologically compelling and add to the road's enigmatic reputation. Local authorities confirm that over the years, a handful of people have failed to return after following the old road, often reappearing hours later at points where no clear path exists, their explanations varying and fragmented. In some accounts, individuals recall stepping over roots or rocks that appear elsewhere moments later, or hearing sounds from one direction while observing movement in another. While none of these accounts suggest deliberate foul play, the consistency of disorientation and temporary disappearance has been enough to caution hikers against casual passage. The road's combination of age, overgrowth, and irregularities makes precise navigation difficult, even for those familiar with surrounding forests. Constructed in the early 20th century, the Tvarditsa road once served as a minor trade route, connecting small villages with larger markets, but decades of neglect have left sections hazardous and overgrown. Historical records note the road's construction primarily from local stone and mortar, designed to endure seasonal rainfall and winter frost, yet time has claimed much of its structural integrity. Documents from regional archives describe periodic maintenance into the 1960s, after which the route gradually fell out of use as vehicle access improved elsewhere. By the early 1980s, the road was largely abandoned, becoming a pathway known more for its enigmatic qualities than its practical function. Reports include travellers finding their way blocked by landslides, temporary erosion, or dense undergrowth, yet in some cases, no obvious obstruction can account for hours of lost time or missing distance. A hiker might pass a fallen tree or overgrown boulder and later encounter the same obstruction in a different configuration, leaving the impression that the path has subtly shifted. Even those with detailed topographical knowledge can experience confusion, particularly when visibility is reduced or attention wavers during prolonged walking. Such observations reinforce the perception that the old road is not merely abandoned, but imbued with a quality that defies straightforward measurement. Experts suggest that repetitive patterns, uniform textures, and a lack of distinct landmarks can induce spatial disorientation, making even short stretches feel labyrinthine and extending perception of time. Psychologists note that in monotonous or highly uniform environments, memory of previous locations can merge, creating the illusion of loops or repeated sections. This may explain some of the road's mysterious reputation, yet it does not fully account for reports of travellers arriving at points inconsistent with the estimated distance, or experiencing a sense of the road's reordering itself. The interplay of cognitive expectation and environmental cues remains a subtle and compelling aspect of the old road's enigma. Despite plausible explanations, the consistent narrative of vanished travellers contributes to the road's reputation as a place where reality and perception intertwine, leaving doubt lingering in every step along its stones. The Tvarditsa road has become a subject of cautious fascination, an intersection of fact and folklore that continues to draw curious hikers, scholars, and local storytellers. While no supernatural element is necessary to explain the experiences along its length, the road's combination of abandonment, environmental complexity, and historical weight ensures it retains a uniquely unsettling character. And for anyone who ventures down the old Tvarditsa road, the certainty of direction may fade entirely, leaving only the uneasy sense that the path itself chooses its own destination.